My name is Hazel, and I am 33 years old. I never thought my own flesh and blood would set me up to rot in a foreign prison, just to fund a destination wedding. Sitting in a sterile, windowless interrogation room at Milan Malpensa Airport, my hands tightly handcuffed to a heavy steel chair, I stared at a black velvet pouch resting on the scratched metal table. Inside that pouch sat $500,000 worth of undeclared stolen diamonds. My family had slipped them into my carry-on bag, stolen my passport, and boarded their first-class flight to Lake Como. They left me stranded, entirely stripped of my identity, facing international smuggling charges. As I sat in detention, bracing for the worst, the heavy metal door swung open. A multimillionaire leaned in and whispered a proposition that would change everything. Trust me, they will regret this. Before I tell you how I turned their ultimate betrayal into their absolute ruin, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been the family scapegoat who finally fought back. The harsh fluorescent lights of the Italian customs office buzzed loudly above my head. The room smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. Across the table, two Italian customs officers glared at me with deep suspicion. The taller one, a man with a stern jawline and zero patience, reached forward and upended the black velvet pouch. Dozens of raw, glittering diamonds spilled onto the metal surface, catching the harsh overhead light. "These were found hidden in the lining of your bag," the officer said in heavily accented English. "You have no declaration forms, you have no identification. You are looking at a minimum of 10 years in a federal penitentiary for international smuggling." My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I shook my head frantically, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into my wrists. "I am an elite forensic corporate auditor," I pleaded, trying to keep my voice steady. "I track missing assets for a living. I do not smuggle them. This has to be a mistake. Please, you have to let me call my family. We were just together at the coffee kiosk in Terminal 3. My father Charles, my mother Vivian, and my sister Peyton. They have my travel documents. They must have picked up my purse by mistake." The second officer let out a dry, humorless laugh. He leaned over the table, placing his hands flat against the cold metal. "You Americans always think you can talk your way out of hard evidence," he said. "Your family did not take your purse by mistake, miss, and they are not coming back for you." He reached for a laptop sitting on a nearby desk, turned the screen toward me, and hit play. What I saw on that screen broke something fundamental inside my soul. It was a high-definition security feed from the airport coffee kiosk taken just an hour ago. On the screen, I watched myself standing at the counter paying for 4 cappuccinos. My family stood directly behind me. I watched my mother Vivian deliberately bump into my arm, sending a scalding cup of coffee spilling across the counter and onto my jacket. On the video, I saw myself frantically turning away to grab a handful of napkins. I remembered apologizing to the barista, feeling terribly clumsy. I did not know it was a perfectly orchestrated distraction. While my back was turned, the footage showed my younger sister Peyton stepping forward. Peyton, the family golden child, the one whose extravagant $1 million destination wedding in Lake Como we were all traveling to attend. With practiced, terrifyingly smooth precision, Peyton unzipped the side pocket of my carry-on bag and dropped the heavy black velvet pouch deep inside. But the betrayal did not stop there. The video continued playing, showing my father Charles, a man who prided himself on his pristine socialite reputation and his supposedly successful logistics company. While I was still scrubbing coffee stains off my jacket, Charles casually reached over and slid my leather purse right off the back of my chair. That purse held my phone, my wallet, and my passport. He tucked it under his tailored overcoat without missing a beat. I sat frozen in the interrogation room, unable to tear my eyes away from the screen as the final seconds of the footage played. I watched my parents and my sister walk away from the kiosk. They did not look back. They did not look guilty. In fact, Peyton threw her head back and laughed at something Charles said as they strode briskly toward their first-class gate. They had intentionally framed me. A sick, heavy realization settled into my stomach. As a forensic auditor, my entire career was built on finding the truth hidden inside manipulated numbers. For months, I had noticed glaring discrepancies in my father's logistics company ledgers. I had warned him that $500,000 in assets were completely unaccounted for. He had brushed me off, calling me a paranoid, low-level bookkeeper who could not handle the pressure of real corporate business. I had built the proprietary software algorithm that ran his entire company 10 years ago, but he had legally buried my involvement, naming Peyton as the brilliant executive face of the brand, while treating me like a glorified underpaid servant. Now, staring at the diamonds on the table, the financial puzzle perfectly clicked into place. Charles and Peyton were bankrupt. They had liquidated stolen company assets into untraceable diamonds to fund Peyton's lavish wedding and keep up their wealthy facade. They needed to smuggle the stones into Italy to sell them to a private buyer. And if customs caught them, they needed a fall guy. They needed someone expendable. They needed the family scapegoat. Tears pricked the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. My family had literally stolen my identity and traded my freedom just to maintain their social status. I was entirely alone in a foreign country facing a decade behind bars, while they were probably sipping champagne on their flight to Lake Como, toasting to their own brilliant cruelty. The lead customs officer slammed the laptop shut, jolting me back to the terrifying reality of the cold room. "You see it now," he said flatly. "Your family used you as a mule. Unfortunately for you, that does not change the law. Without identification, you are a Jane Doe carrying stolen goods. We are transferring you to the holding facility." Panic, raw and suffocating, seized my throat. "Please," I begged, pulling against the handcuffs. "You have to trace their flight. You have the video evidence. They are the ones who committed the crime. You cannot just lock me away." The officer ignored my pleas, grabbing a stack of intake forms and a heavy ring of keys. I closed my eyes, the weight of my impending ruin crashing down on me. I had survived a lifetime of their emotional abuse, their constant belittling, and their blatant theft of my professional work. But this was different. This was a death sentence. Just as the officer reached for my arm to pull me out of the chair, a loud, sharp knock echoed through the room. Before either guard could respond, the heavy metal door swung open with authoritative force. The air in the room shifted instantly. A man stepped across the threshold, bringing with him an aura of absolute power and ruthless control. He was tall, perhaps 38 years old, wearing a dark, bespoke American suit that screamed quiet, untouchable wealth. His sharp jawline and piercing eyes scanned the room briefly, assessing the scattered diamonds before locking directly onto me. He was flanked by 3 men carrying sleek briefcases, their expensive Italian suits indicating they were high-powered attorneys. The customs officers immediately stepped back, their aggressive demeanor dissolving into nervous deference. The American man did not wait for an introduction. He walked straight to the metal table, pulled out the chair opposite me, and sat down. He completely ignored the guards and the stolen gems. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and slid a sleek black burner phone across the metal surface until it rested against my handcuffed wrists. He leaned forward, his gaze intense and unwavering. "I know exactly who you are, Hazel," he said, his voice a low, commanding rumble. "I saw what they did at the kiosk. And more importantly, I know exactly where Charles and Peyton are heading." I stared at him, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He offered a cold, calculated smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "Someone who despises corporate thieves just as much as you do," he replied. "My name is Harrison. I can make these charges disappear right now. I can get your handcuffs removed, and I can give you your life back. But you have to pretend you are with me. My private jet is waiting on the tarmac." I looked at the burner phone, then up at his piercing eyes. "Why would you help me?" I asked, the cynical auditor in me immediately looking for the catch. "Because your family thinks they have won," Harrison whispered, leaning in closer so the guards could not hear. "They think they have buried you. Come with me to Lake Como. Trust me, they will regret this." The heavy metal door of the interrogation room swung open with such force that it slammed against the concrete wall. The sharp, violent sound made me jolt in my seat, the cold steel handcuffs biting into my bruised wrists. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, but my eyes remained fixed on the entrance. A man stepped across the threshold, bringing with him an aura of absolute power and ruthless control. He was tall, striking, and dressed in a dark, bespoke American suit that screamed quiet, untouchable wealth. His sharp jawline and piercing eyes scanned the dismal room, briefly assessing the scattered glittering diamonds on the metal table before locking directly onto me. He was flanked by three older men carrying sleek leather briefcases. Their tailored Italian suits and rigid posture immediately marked them as high-powered attorneys. The two customs officers who had been relentlessly interrogating me took a sudden nervous step back, their aggressive demeanor dissolving into immediate deference. The American man did not wait for an invitation or offer a polite introduction. He strode straight to the metal table, pulled out the chair opposite me, and sat down with total ownership of the space. Without breaking eye contact with me, he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, pulled out a slim leather wallet, and slid a diplomatic identification card across the scratched metal table. The lead customs officer leaned over to inspect it, his eyes widening. Before the guard could speak, the three lawyers stepped forward in perfect synchronization. In rapid, flawless, and heavily authoritative Italian, they completely dismantled the officer's protocol. Though my Italian was rusty, I understood enough. The attorneys pointed out the blatant illegalities of the interrogation, the lack of formal representation, the absence of an official translator, and the absolute procedural failures of holding an American citizen under these conditions. The officers deflated their previous arrogance, replaced by stammering apologies. The American man ignored their panic entirely. He reached into his jacket once more and placed a sleek black burner phone on the table, slowly sliding it until it rested right against my chained hands. He leaned in close. The faint, clean scent of expensive cedar and rain cut through the stale air of the holding room. His gaze was intense, unwavering, and chillingly calm. "Pretend you are with me," he whispered, his voice a low, commanding rumble that sent a shiver down my spine. "My jet is waiting. Trust me, they will regret this." For a fraction of a second, the desperate, terrified part of my brain wanted to nod, to blindly accept this miraculous rescue and run far away from the threat of a foreign prison. But I was not a damsel in distress. I was a 33-year-old elite forensic corporate auditor. I had spent my entire adult life surviving the emotional landmines of my deeply toxic family. I survived by relying on hard facts, paper trails, and cold logic. I did not do blind trust, and I certainly did not walk onto private jets with mysterious billionaires offering impossible favors. I looked at the black phone resting against my knuckles, then slowly lifted my gaze to meet his piercing eyes. I refused to touch the device. "I do not know you," I said, my voice raspy from hours of crying and shouting, yet surprisingly steady. "And I do not accept miraculous favors from strangers in holding cells. I need to know exactly who you are, how you found me, and why you care about a framed woman facing international smuggling charges." The man leaned back in his chair, studying me. A genuine, slightly dangerous smile touched the corners of his mouth. He seemed to appreciate my resistance, perhaps even expect it. He raised a hand, slightly a silent command to his legal team. The attorneys immediately stepped toward the customs officers, politely but firmly ushering the baffled guards out into the hallway. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving the two of us entirely alone in the suffocating silence of the interrogation room. "My name is Harrison," he said smoothly, crossing his arms over his chest. "Harrison Vance. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Holdings." The breath hitched in my throat. The name hit me with the force of a physical blow. Vanguard Holdings. It was the exact American venture capital conglomerate that my father Charles and my sister Peyton had been desperately courting for the past 8 months. They were in Italy right now, heading to Lake Como, not just for Peyton's extravagant million-dollar destination wedding, but to secure a $50 million corporate buyout from Vanguard. That buyout was the only thing standing between our family logistics company and total bankruptcy. Harrison watched the recognition wash over my face, his eyes missing nothing. I saw the entire setup at the coffee kiosk. Harrison explained, his tone shifting from authoritative to strictly business. I prefer to observe the people I am buying from before I sign my name to a $50 million contract. I was sitting at a cafe table 50 yards away, doing my own groundwork on Charles. I watched your mother stage that ridiculous coffee spill to distract you. I watched your golden child sister slip a velvet pouch of stolen assets into your bag. And I watched your father slide your purse off the back of your chair, taking your passport and phone so you could not escape or call for help. Tears pricked my eyes again, but I forced them down, refusing to cry in front of this man. Hearing a stranger narrate the ultimate betrayal of my own flesh and blood made the nightmare undeniably real. They had sacrificed my freedom just to save themselves. But why the diamonds? I asked, my analytical mind fighting through the crushing grief. Why risk international smuggling when they are 2 days away from a $50 million payout? Because your father's logistics empire is a mirage, Harrison stated flatly. My initial analysts flagged minor inconsistencies in his quarterly reports, but nothing concrete enough to halt the deal. I knew he was hiding massive debt. I just could not prove it. Those diamonds are stolen company assets. They were meant to be liquidated here in Italy to quietly cover a missing $500,000 in their accounts before my final audit team tears through their books next week. If that money is not replaced, the Vanguard deal dies and your father goes to federal prison for embezzlement. I stared at him, the financial puzzle perfectly clicking into place. They needed a fall guy, I whispered, the sickening realization settling heavy in my chest. If customs caught the diamonds, I took the blame. If customs missed them, they got to sell the stones, replace the missing funds, and sign the Vanguard deal. Either way, they won. Harrison nodded slowly. They needed someone expendable, someone whose absence at the wedding could be easily explained away. They used you. I looked down at my chained hands. For years, I had been the family scapegoat. I was the one who built their proprietary logistics algorithm from scratch 10 years ago, only for Charles to legally bury my involvement and name Peyton as the brilliant executive face of the brand. I had allowed them to steal my intellectual property and treat me like an underpaid servant because I foolishly craved their love and approval. Today, they proved exactly what my loyalty meant to them: absolutely nothing. So where do I fit into this? I asked, meeting Harrison's intense gaze once more. You have your attorneys. You can walk away from the deal right now. I cannot just walk away without exposing the fraud, Harrison replied, his voice hardening with ruthless corporate pragmatism. If Vanguard pulls out of a highly publicized acquisition without undeniable insider proof of criminal activity, we take a massive financial and reputational hit. Charles will spin it to the media, play the victim, and find another buyer. I need to freeze their domestic assets before they sign that international contract on Saturday. And to do that, I need the one person who knows their numbers better than anyone else. I need the woman who actually built their software. He pushed the black burner phone another inch toward my fingers. I am offering you a deal, Hazel, he said quietly. Act as my secret weapon at the wedding. Walk into that Lake Como villa on my arm, dismantle their fraudulent empire from the inside, tear down the beautiful facade they have built, and hand me the proof I need to bury them. And if I refuse, I challenge testing the boundaries of his offer. Then I walk out that door. My lawyers stop translating. The Italian guards come back in, and you go to a federal holding cell while your family drinks vintage champagne and toasts to their brilliant escape, Harrison replied. His tone was entirely devoid of pity, offering only cold, hard reality. But looking at your face, I have a strong feeling you are finally tired of paying for their sins. The silence in the room stretched out thick and heavy with the weight of my entire past. I thought of my mother's fake, panicked gasp as the coffee spilled. I thought of Peyton's cruel, triumphant smirk as she walked away toward the departure gate. I thought of my father, the man who was supposed to protect me, carrying my stolen passport in his coat pocket. They had left me to rot. A slow burning fire ignited in my chest, burning away the last remaining shreds of daughterly devotion and sisterly love. I was an elite auditor. I destroyed corrupt corporations for a living. It was time I audited my own family. I took a deep breath, reached forward, and wrapped my fingers firmly around the cold black phone. "Get these handcuffs off me," I said, my voice ringing with a dangerous new clarity. "We have a wedding to crash." The walk from the holding cell to the private tarmac was a blur of echoing corridors and silent Italian guards parting like the Red Sea. I stepped out into the humid Milan air, the heavy scent of jet fuel mixing with the faint, distant smell of incoming rain. A sleek, black helicopter sat waiting on the concrete, its rotors already slicing through the dense afternoon heat with a deafening rhythm that vibrated right through the soles of my shoes. Harrison did not pause to see if I was following. He moved with a kind of predatory grace that dictated the world would naturally bend to his schedule, and for the first time in my entire life, I fell into step beside someone else's absolute power instead of shrinking away from it. Once inside the spacious leather-lined cabin, the heavy doors sealed shut, cutting off the engine noise and leaving us in a pressurized bubble of pure luxury. Harrison took the seat opposite me immediately, gesturing to a thick canvas garment bag hanging neatly beside a small vanity mirror built into the cabin wall. "You cannot walk into a high society event looking like a detained smuggler," he stated, his eyes dropping briefly to the massive brown coffee stain ruining my sensible travel blazer. My team had a few options sent over. "Change. We have 30 minutes until we cross the lake." I unzipped the bag to find a stunning, structured emerald green dress. It was made of heavy, expensive silk that felt like liquid armor. Beside it sat a pair of black designer stilettos and a minimalist leather tote. It was the kind of outfit my mother would have deemed far too sophisticated for my dreary personality. I stepped into the small enclosed changing partition at the back of the cabin. As I peeled off my sticky, rumpled clothes, I felt as though I was physically shedding the pathetic, compliant daughter I had been just an hour ago. I slid the emerald silk over my shoulders. The tailoring was incredibly precise, hugging my frame and forcing me to stand taller, pulling my shoulders back. I wiped the smudged mascara from under my eyes, applied a sharp slash of dark red lipstick from the vanity drawer, and stepped back into the main cabin. I was no longer the frazzled scapegoat. I looked like a woman who could dismantle a company with a single signature. Harrison gave a slow, approving nod as I took my seat. He did not waste time on empty compliments. Instead, he flipped open a heavily encrypted laptop resting on the polished walnut table between us and pushed it toward my side. "Show me exactly how he did it," Harrison commanded. I stared at the glowing screen. The Vanguard preliminary audit files were laid out in massive, complex spreadsheets, detailing every moving part of Charles and Peyton Logistics' empire. My fingers hovered over the trackpad. It had been years since I had looked at my father's operational data, but the underlying architecture was still exactly the same. It was the same because I was the one who built it. I clicked into the routing optimization algorithms, my eyes scanning the endless rows of code and supply chain metrics. A bitter taste flooded my mouth as the numbers revealed the depth of their deception. "He is using phantom warehousing," I said, my voice steadying as I highlighted 3 specific repeating anomalies buried deep in the European distribution networks. "See these transit times. He is claiming inventory sits in staging facilities in Munich and Frankfurt for exactly 48 hours before moving. But the logistics framework I designed does not require staging delays. It routes straight to distribution. He is logging ghost inventory to inflate his quarterly assets, borrowing against freight that does not exist, and using the cash to cover a massive operational deficit. The diamonds were just a panicked last-minute patch for a margin call he could not fake his way out of today." Harrison watched me closely, his intense gaze shifting from the screen to my face. "You know the framework perfectly because you wrote the core software 10 years ago." I looked up, meeting his eyes without flinching. I was 23 years old. I spent 18 brutal months locked in a cramped basement office, writing every single line of that predictive logistics algorithm. It was brilliant. It cut shipping delays by 40% and reduced overall overhead by millions of dollars. I brought the finalized code to Charles, thinking I had finally earned my place at his table. I thought I had finally made him proud. I paused, pushing down the old familiar sting of rejection that threatened to rise in my throat. He took the hard drive, smiled at me, and said it was a nice little project. 2 weeks later, he filed the patent. He named Peyton as the sole creator and chief executive of technology. Peyton, who barely knew how to operate a spreadsheet without asking for my help. When I stormed into his office and demanded my rightful ownership, demanded fair compensation for my intellectual property, he laughed right in my face. He told me I was a difficult, jealous failure who could not stand to see her beautiful sister succeed. He fired me, locked me out of the building, and spent the next year telling their entire high society circle that I was mentally unstable and entirely unemployable. They built a kingdom on your brain, Harrison noted quietly, his voice lacking any pity, replacing it entirely with cold, hard respect. And they put a crown on Peyton's head. Yes, I said, clicking out of the spreadsheet and closing the laptop with a soft, definitive click. And today they tried to bury me under a foreign prison, just to keep that crown from slipping. They think I am powerless. They think I am sitting on a metal chair crying my eyes out, waiting for a lawyer who will never come. Harrison reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a thick black lanyard attached to a heavy gold-plated credential. He held it out to me. The heavy card caught the cabin light. Then it is time to remind them exactly who built the foundation they are standing on, Harrison said. I took the lanyard. The heavy plastic credential bore the Vanguard Holdings crest in embossed gold. Beneath the crest, my name was printed in bold block letters. Hazel. And beneath my name, a title that made a dangerous thrill rush straight through my veins. Lead Acquisition Auditor. You are going to walk into that welcome party, Harrison instructed, his voice dropping into a lethal quiet register. You are going to look Charles and Peyton dead in the eye. You are going to represent the very company holding their entire financial survival in its hands. If they so much as blink wrong, you kill the $50 million buyout. You own them now, Hazel. I slipped the lanyard over my head, letting the heavy credential rest against the dark emerald silk of my dress. The physical weight of the badge felt like a loaded weapon. For 33 years, my family had relied on my silence, my fear, and my desperate need for their validation. They had banked everything on the assumption that I would quietly take the fall for their crimes. They had severely miscalculated my breaking point. The helicopter banked sharply, the sudden change in momentum pulling my attention toward the small oval window. Below us, the deep sapphire waters of Lake Como stretched out like a sheet of dark glass surrounded by dramatic towering mountains. Nestled into the cliffside was a jaw-dropping historic villa. Terraced gardens cascaded down toward the water, blooming with white roses and climbing ivy. Even from this altitude, I could see the massive, lavish welcome party in full swing on the lower manicured lawns. Waiters carrying silver trays of champagne wove through a crowd of wealthy guests, dressed in pastel summer suits and flowing designer gowns. Somewhere in that sea of arrogant, oblivious wealth, my father was shaking hands, and my sister was showing off her diamond engagement ring, fully believing they had successfully thrown my life away. The pilot initiated our descent. The helicopter hovered over the pristine stone helipad situated at the very top of the villa grounds. The roar of the rotors kicked up a massive cloud of dust and sent ripples across the surface of the nearby infinity pool. The landing skids touched down against the stone with a solid, heavy thud that reverberated through the floorboards. Harrison stood up, smoothing the lapels of his immaculate suit. He looked down at me, his eyes gleaming with quiet anticipation, ready to work. I stood up, adjusting the strap of my leather tote bag, feeling the Vanguard credential resting heavily against my chest. I looked out the window at the grand stone staircase leading down to the party below. I am ready to burn it all down, I said. The co-pilot pulled the lever and the cabin door slid open, letting in the warm, fragrant Italian evening air. I stepped out onto the helipad, the wind from the slowing rotors whipping my hair around my face. I squared my shoulders, raised my chin, and prepared for war. The descent from the helipad took us down a winding path of ancient stone steps, flanked by fragrant lemon trees and manicured hedges. With every step toward the sprawling terrace, the low thrum of a string quartet and the bright chatter of high society grew louder. I moved beside Harrison, our paces perfectly synchronized. He offered his arm as we approached the grand arched entryway of the Villa main ballroom. I rested my hand lightly on his tailored sleeve, feeling the solid, reassuring muscle beneath the fine wool. We stepped through the towering glass doors and into a room bathed in golden light from crystal chandeliers. The sheer opulence of the welcome party was staggering, a sea of silk linen and glittering jewels against a backdrop of Renaissance frescoes. We glided into the crowd, our presence commanding an immediate, palpable shift in the atmosphere. The music seemed to fade into a low hum. Conversations tapered off into confused murmurs as heads turned toward the striking American billionaire and his unknown emerald-clad companion. My eyes scanned the room, cutting through the crowd of strangers, until they landed precisely where I knew they would. Standing near a towering champagne pyramid was the picture-perfect family. My father, Charles, was mid-laugh holding a crystal flute. My mother, Vivian, stood elegantly beside him in a cream designer gown, clutching a silver-beaded evening bag. And Peyton, draped in a white silk cocktail dress that likely cost more than my annual salary, hung off the arm of her fiancé, Cameron. I stopped moving. Harrison halted right beside me, a silent, imposing sentinel. I stared directly at my mother. It took 3 seconds for the reality of my presence to register on her perfectly lifted face. Vivian gasped a sharp, ragged sound, and her silver clutch slipped from her fingers. It hit the marble floor with a loud crack that echoed across the room. Charles turned his head to see what had startled his wife. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving his complexion a sickly, chalky gray. The champagne flute in his hand tipped precariously, spilling vintage wine onto his expensive Italian loafers. Peyton froze. The brilliant, practiced smile she had been flashing at a nearby guest morphed into a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. Her knuckles turned white as she gripped Cameron by the arm. They looked as if they had just seen a ghost. In a way, they had. They expected me to be locked away in a concrete cell, silenced and erased from their perfect lives forever. Yet here I stood, draped in silk, radiating absolute confidence. The paralysis lasted only a moment before self-preservation kicked in. Charles and Vivian exchanged a frantic, panicked glance. They abandoned Peyton and moved through the crowd with terrifying speed. Their smiles were plastered back onto their faces, tight and unnatural, as they closed the distance between us. They approached me not as a daughter they had missed, but as a crisis that needed to be contained immediately. "Oh, Hazel, darling!" Vivian chirped loudly, her voice shrill enough to carry to the nearby guests. "We were so worried about you." Before I could say a word, she clamped her hand onto my bare arm. Her manicured nails dug into my skin like talons. Charles materialized on my other side, his grip equally bruising on my elbow. Without acknowledging Harrison, who simply stepped back with a mild, observant expression, they practically dragged me away from the main floor. They forced me down a secluded, opulent hallway lined with antique tapestries and heavy velvet curtains, far away from the prying eyes of their wealthy friends. The moment the heavy oak doors swung shut behind us, the fake smiles vanished. The pristine hallway suddenly felt like a trap. Vivian rounded on me, her eyes flashing with feral desperation. "What do you think you are doing here?" she hissed, her voice vibrating with barely contained rage. "How did you get out?" I stood my ground, refusing to rub the spot on my arm where her nails had left crescent-shaped marks. "I took a helicopter," I replied simply. Charles stepped aggressively close, using his height to try and intimidate me, a tactic that had worked flawlessly for 3 decades. "Have you lost your mind?" he demanded, his face inches from mine. "You wander off like an idiot at the airport, you carelessly lose your own passport, and then you stalk us all the way to Italy. You are completely unhinged." The sheer audacity of the gaslighting was breathtaking. They were doubling down on the lie, trying to make me feel crazy, trying to convince me that the calculated theft of my documents and the planted diamonds were somehow my own careless fault. "We were terrified," Vivian snapped, stepping forward to flank my father. "We searched the entire terminal for you. You just vanished. We had to board our flight, Hazel. We had a wedding to get to. And now you show up here causing a scene, trying to ruin your sister's special week just because you are jealous and unstable." I stared at them, absorbing the toxic, familiar rhythm of their attacks. In the past, this coordinated assault would have sent me into a spiral of self-doubt and tears. I would have believed I was the problem. I would have apologized. "If you do not leave this property right now," Charles threatened, his voice dropping to a vicious whisper, "I am calling the Italian police. I will tell them you are a disturbed, obsessed stalker who has been harassing our family. I will have you thrown into a psychiatric hold before you can even blink. You have no money, no passport, and no power here, Hazel. You are nothing." I did not flinch. I did not cry. I did not shrink away from the man who had stolen my life work. Instead, I let out a soft, cold laugh that echoed off the high, painted ceilings of the corridor. The sound clearly unsettled them. They expected a frightened girl pleading for help. They did not expect ice. I reached up and pulled the heavy gold and black lanyard from the neckline of my dress, letting it dangle freely against the emerald silk. Charles' eyes darted to the credential. I watched the exact moment his brain processed the embossed logo of Vanguard Holdings. The threat of calling the police died instantly in his throat. "You really should call them Dad," I said, my voice dripping with quiet, lethal authority. "I am sure the authorities would love to review the security footage from Terminal 3. The footage that shows Mom spilling her coffee while Peyton stuffs $500,000 in stolen diamonds into my bag." Charles took a physical step back as if I had struck him. Vivian covered her mouth, her eyes widening in absolute horror. "You see, I did not stalk you here," I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step forward, forcing them to retreat. "I am here as the personal guest of Vanguard Holdings' elite corporate representation. That man you just rudely ignored in the ballroom. That is Harrison Vance. He is the chief executive officer of the conglomerate you are begging for a bailout, and I am his lead acquisition auditor." The silence in the hallway was deafening, broken only by the distant muffled sounds of the string quartet playing in the ballroom. My parents looked at the badge, then up at my face, their expressions crumbling into a mixture of disbelief and absolute panic. They had built their entire fraudulent scheme on the assumption that I would quietly take the fall. Now the very person they tried to destroy was holding the keys to their survival. "If you cause a scene," I said, leaning in close so they could hear every single syllable of their impending ruin. "If you raise your voices, if you threaten me with the police, or if you ever lay a hand on me again, I will walk back out there and tell Harrison to kill the $50 million buyout tonight. Vanguard will freeze your domestic assets by morning, and your fraudulent little logistics shell company will be bankrupt before Peyton even walks down the aisle." I watched them process the trap they had built for themselves. They were completely paralyzed by their own greed. They needed the Vanguard deal to survive the federal audits they knew were coming, and they now realized that I had the power to sever that lifeline with a single word. "You are going to open those oak doors," I instructed, my tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "You are going to walk me back into that party. You are going to smile, and you are going to loudly introduce me to all of your wealthy, oblivious guests as your beloved, brilliant daughter. And you are going to treat me with the respect I should have demanded 10 years ago. Do we have a deal?" Charles swallowed hard, the muscles in his jaw working furiously as he nodded. Vivian looked like she might be sick, but she quickly smoothed the front of her gown, terrified of losing the lifestyle she prized above her own child. They turned and pushed the heavy doors open, leading me back out onto the terrace. As we re-entered the glowing ballroom, the crowd turned to look. Charles cleared his throat, plastering on a rigid, trembling smile. "Everyone," he announced, his voice tight, "please welcome our eldest daughter, Hazel." The guests politely applauded, completely unaware of the bloodbath that had just occurred in the hallway. I smiled and waved, standing tall and untouchable in my emerald silk. But across the room, standing frozen by the champagne pyramid, Peyton was not clapping. Her hands were balled into tight fists at her sides, and her eyes burned with pure, unadulterated hatred. The war had officially begun. The ballroom air felt thick with anticipation as Harrison guided me smoothly away from my parents and toward a small circle of international investors and Vanguard executives standing near the terrace doors. The men and women in the group immediately parted to make room for us. their eyes darting to my heavy gold credential before meeting my gaze with genuine professional curiosity. For the next hour, I did what I do best. I engaged them in razor-sharp conversations about supply chain logistics, emerging market tariffs, and the intricate financial architecture of corporate acquisitions. I discussed the volatile nature of European trade routes and the statistical probability of freight loss. I did not stumble. I did not stutter. I held my own with some of the most powerful people in the room, and I could feel Harrison watching me with a quiet, appreciative intensity. His presence beside me was an undeniable endorsement, granting me an immediate elevated status among his peers. But across the ballroom, the temperature was dropping. Peyton was not used to sharing the spotlight, let alone losing it completely to the sister she had spent her entire life stepping on. Every time I glanced over, her eyes were locked on me, narrowing with an ugly, simmering rage. Her perfect engagement party was being hijacked by the very person she had tried to leave rotting in a Milanese holding cell. The Vanguard Battle 5 IPs, who were supposed to be fawning over her and Cameron, were completely engrossed in my analysis of asset valuation. The golden child was being ignored, and her frustration was palpable, radiating across the room like heat off a sun-baked highway. Eventually, the delicate clinking of a silver spoon against crystal cut through the low hum of conversation. The string quartet faded to silence as the wealthy guests turned their attention toward the grand marble staircase at the center of the room. Peyton stood on the third step, bathed in a warm spotlight, holding a microphone in one hand and a glass of champagne in the other. Cameron stood a step below her, flashing his perfectly bleached aristocratic smile. Peyton beamed at the crowd, the absolute picture of radiant bridal perfection. She thanked everyone for traveling to Italy. She gushed about the magical venue, and she practically purred when she mentioned how excited she was to welcome the Vanguard Holdings team to their intimate family celebration. And then her gaze shifted. It drifted over the affluent crowd and landed squarely on me. The brilliant smile remained plastered on her face, but her eyes went dead and cold. I want to take a special moment tonight to acknowledge someone very dear to my heart. Peyton announced, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness that coated the ballroom like syrup. My older sister, Hazel. The crowd parted slightly, leaving Harrison and me exposed to the room. I felt 100 pairs of eyes shift my way. You all know me as the executive face of the company. Peyton continued, placing a dramatic, sympathetic hand over her heart. But what you do not know is how hard I try to take care of my family behind the scenes. Hazel is our sweet, quiet bookkeeper. She has always struggled so much with the pressure of the real corporate world. She lives alone in a tiny, cramped little apartment back home, and she does not have much. She does not have a partner to lean on, and she certainly does not have the means to travel. So when Cameron and I decided on Lake Como, I told my parents we simply had to bring her along as our charity case for the week. We just want her to feel included for once in her life before she goes back to her lonely desk. A heavy, awkward silence fell over the ballroom. Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their expensive suits, casting pitying glances my way. Vivian and Charles stood near the bar, their faces tight but compliant, allowing Peyton to publicly execute my dignity just to reassert her dominance. They expected me to react the way I always had when I was younger. They expected the crushing weight of social anxiety to paralyze my chest. They expected me to flush bright red, drop my gaze to the floor, and quietly excuse myself to cry in the nearest bathroom. "Let us all raise a glass to Hazel," Peyton prompted, gesturing toward me with her microphone. "Come on, Hazel, do not be shy. Stand up tall and give a little toast. Say thank you to the family who brought you here." Harrison tensed slightly beside me, his jaw clenching as he anticipated the cruelty of the moment. He shifted his weight, preparing to intervene, but I placed a gentle hand on his arm to stop him. I did not shrink. The anxious, fearful girl who used to crave their validation had died in that airport interrogation room. I smoothly reached over to a passing waiter and lifted a fresh crystal flute of vintage champagne from his silver tray. The cool glass felt grounding in my hand. I stepped away from Harrison, moving perfectly into the center of the crowd. The emerald silk of my dress caught the chandelier light, radiating a quiet, undeniable power. I raised my glass toward my sister, keeping my expression entirely serene. "Thank you, Peyton." I began, my voice carrying effortlessly across the grand ballroom without the need for a microphone. I spoke with the polished, commanding cadence of a woman who was absolutely certain of her own worth. It is true, I have always preferred the quiet details over the loud spotlight. While my sister has been busy being the beautiful, charismatic face of the operation, I have spent my time digging into the numbers. And if there is one thing forensic auditing teaches you, it is the true value of hidden assets. I paused, letting the phrase hang in the heavy air. The Vanguard executives in the crowd leaned in immediately, catching the double meaning. Harrison smiled softly, raising his glass in silent approval. People often look at a shiny, flawless exterior and assume the foundation underneath is equally solid. I continued, my eyes tracking from Peyton down to Cameron. They see a luxury lifestyle, a sprawling villa, or a brand new Italian sports car, and they assume the accounts are overflowing. But the numbers never lie. Sometimes the most glittering facades are built on entirely empty vaults. True wealth is not about what you demand people see. True wealth is about what you actually own when the audits are closed and the debts are called in. The crowd murmured in appreciation, several of the older investors nodding in absolute agreement at the sharp, eloquent business sentiment. But Peyton was not nodding. Her fake smile was beginning to tremble. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my champagne, letting the crisp, dry vintage linger on my tongue before I delivered the final blow. I turned my attention fully to Cameron, who was standing just below Peyton, with a complacent, arrogant grin still plastered across his face. "For example," I said casually, my voice dropping to a conversational volume that somehow commanded the entire room. "Take Cameron here. To the untrained eye, he is the perfect wealthy groom. But if you look closely at the mechanics of an irrevocable trust depletion, things get so much more interesting." Cameron's smile vanished instantly. His posture went entirely rigid, the color draining from his tanned face. It is fascinating how a trust fund liquidated 3 years ago can still somehow project the illusion of generational wealth, I mused aloud, swirling the champagne in my glass. It makes you wonder how someone manages to maintain leases on 3 luxury vehicles when their sole financial strategy relies entirely on their fiancé securing a corporate buyout just to keep the repo men away. But then again, that is the beauty of hidden liabilities, isn't it? The silence that followed was absolute, complete, and devastating. Cameron let out a sudden violent cough, choking hard on the champagne he had just swallowed. His face turned a splotchy, panicked red as he pounded on his own chest, sputtering and gasping for air. The affluent guests surrounding him physically stepped back, their faces registering the shock of the accusation. Peyton dropped the microphone. It hit the marble steps with a deafening, shrieking feedback loop that made everyone in the room wince. She stared at Cameron, her eyes wide with a frantic, uncomprehending terror, before whipping her head back toward me. Her chest heaved, her perfect bridal facade entirely shattered by the realization that her wealthy groom was absolutely broke and that I held the match that had just lit their entire house of cards on fire. The sharp, piercing squeal of the microphone feedback hung over the ballroom for several excruciating seconds. No one moved. The wealthy elite, usually so insulated from genuine scandal, stood completely paralyzed by the raw, unscripted implosion of their favorite golden couple. Harrison placed a warm, steady hand on the small of my back, a silent anchor amidst the chaos. He did not gloat. He simply guided me through the parted sea of gaping guests, leading me out of the ballroom and into the cool, quiet Italian night. We left Charles frantically signaling the waitstaff to cut the microphone power, while Vivian lunged forward to shield her hyperventilating daughter from the whispers already spreading like wildfire through the crowd. The next 24 hours passed in a state of highly calculated anticipation. We relocated to the private wing of the villa that Harrison had secured for his executive team, a sprawling suite with vaulted ceilings and a balcony that overlooked the misty gray morning waters of Lake Como. I was sitting at a glass dining table with a cup of black espresso when Harrison walked into the room. He had already been awake for hours, dressed in a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, projecting a calm but dangerous energy. He set his phone face down on the glass table and took the seat across from me. "Your father is panicking," Harrison said, his voice a low, steady rumble. My people just intercepted a string of communications between his legal team and mine. Charles is trying to accelerate the timeline. He knows that little stunt you pulled last night exposed a massive crack in their perfect facade. He realizes that if Vanguard starts digging into Cameron-depleted trust fund, we might start digging deeper into the logistics company too. He is terrified of losing the lifeline. I took a slow sip of the bitter espresso. So what is his move? He is calling in every social favor he has left. Harrison explained, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table. He is leveraging his relationships with two of my oldest board members, men he plays golf with back in the States, trying to bypass our standard final audit period. He is demanding that we sign the preliminary buyout contracts tonight at the rehearsal dinner. He framed it as a grand symbolic gesture of unity before the wedding tomorrow. If I refuse to sign in front of all those witnesses, he will spin it to the board as a personal insult and walk away, effectively killing the deal on his own terms and retaining his victim status. If I do sign, Vanguard is legally bound to the acquisition, and the moment the ink dries, he gets an immediate cash infusion that covers all of his tracks. He wants to corner you into signing before you can officially find the missing $500,000, I said, setting my cup down. He is trying to force your hand publicly. Exactly, Harrison said, his eyes locking onto mine. And right now, all I have is a strong suspicion and a bag of confiscated diamonds sitting in an Italian customs evidence locker. Suspicion is not enough to breach a corporate contract of this magnitude without risking a massive lawsuit. I need the bullet, Hazel. I need the absolute, undeniable proof of his embezzlement before I sit down at that head table tonight. I looked out the balcony doors at the sweeping mountain landscape. Charles was arrogant, and arrogant men were notoriously lazy. When he fired me and stole my software a decade ago, he had been too cheap to hire a completely new development team to rebuild the architecture. He had simply slapped a new graphic interface over my original code and called it proprietary. If he was still using the same core logic for his international shipping algorithms, there was a very high probability he was still using the same local server infrastructure to hide his dirty numbers. I need your computer, I said, turning back to Harrison, and I need the administrative access password to the Villa Secure network. Charles would not trust cloud storage for a fraudulent ledger. He is old school. He would keep a local encrypted backup on a physical drive, and he would route it through whatever secure network he is currently connected to. Harrison did not ask questions. He slid his sleek black laptop across the glass and typed in the network credentials. I cracked my knuckles and went to work. The interface was different, but the pathways were as familiar to me as the lines on my own palms. I bypassed the Villa primary firewall and located the secure partition server Charles had established for his personal devices. The front door of his network was heavily guarded, boasting expensive top-tier commercial encryption. But I did not need to go through the front door. When I was 23, working out of that miserable, windowless basement office, I had coded a tiny invisible back door into the server registry so I could troubleshoot the system remotely from my apartment. Charles never knew it existed, and he had never paid anyone competent enough to find it. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing the old, deeply buried command lines. A black terminal window popped open on the screen. A cursor blinked twice, and then the system granted me total, unrestricted administrative access. I am in, I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs as I opened the master file directory. I bypassed the polished fake quarterly reports meant for Vanguard and dug straight into the raw, unedited internal ledgers. The data poured across the screen in an endless waterfall of text. It took me less than 10 minutes to find it. There, buried under layers of dummy corporations and fake maintenance fees, was the gaping hole. Exactly $500,000 had been bled out of the company operating budget over the past 6 months. And right next to that deficit was a transit manifest for a shipment of industrial drill bits routed through Milan. The listed weight of the drill bits matched the exact carat weight of the diamonds Peyton had slipped into my bag. I downloaded the entire payload, transferring the unedited ledgers and the forged transit manifests onto a secure external drive. I pulled the drive free and held it up, the small piece of metal catching the morning light. "I have the bullet," I said. Harrison let out a slow, deeply satisfied breath. A predatory smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Then let us go to a dinner party." The rehearsal dinner was held on the lower sweeping terrace of the villa, situated right at the edge of the dark, lapping lake. Strings of warm, glowing fairy lights were woven through the ancient olive trees, casting a soft, romantic glow over the dozens of round tables draped in crisp white linen. A massive head table was positioned at the far end of the terrace, overlooking the water, clearly reserved for the family and the most elite Vanguard executives. I arrived a few minutes after the majority of the guests had taken their seats. I wore a sleek, tailored black jumpsuit that felt like armor, my hair pulled back into a severe, elegant twist. The moment my heels clicked against the stone terrace, Vivian materialized out of the crowd like a heat-seeking missile. She wore a forced, painfully tight smile, her eyes darting nervously toward Harrison, who was already standing near the head table, conversing with his board members. She stepped directly into my path, physically blocking my progression through the tables. "Hazel, darling," Vivian cooed, her voice pitched perfectly to sound like a loving, attentive mother to anyone listening nearby. She reached out and grasped my forearms, her fingers squeezing hard enough to leave bruises. Her smile never wavered, but her voice dropped into a venomous, panicked hiss. "You have had your fun. You made your little point last night. But tonight is about business. Charles is closing the deal of a lifetime, and you are not going to ruin this for us." She released my arms and gestured gracefully toward the very back of the terrace, near the swinging doors of the kitchen where the waitstaff were rushing back and forth with trays of food. Sitting at a small, poorly lit table in the corner were my 4 teenage cousins, currently engrossed in their smartphones and ignoring the event entirely. "I have arranged a special spot just for you." Vivian continued, her voice dripping with sickly sweet condescension as she tried to herd me backward. "You will be so much more comfortable back there with the younger kids, far away from all the boring corporate talk. You know how easily you get overwhelmed by business matters, sweetie. You just sit quietly, eat your dinner, and let the adults handle the real work." She attempted to place a guiding hand on the small of my back to physically push me toward the kitchen doors. I did not move. I stood completely rigid, staring down at the woman who had spent my entire life trying to make me small. I felt the hard metallic edge of the external drive pressing against the inside of my pocket. I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice, and I certainly did not let her see a single ounce of hurt. Instead, I smoothly stepped around her outstretched hand. I walked directly past the bewildered guests, ignoring Vivian's desperate, muted gasp behind me. I marched straight up to the head table where Charles was currently holding court, laughing loudly and pouring vintage red wine for 2 of the Vanguard board members. I grabbed a heavy carved wooden chair from an adjacent table and dragged it across the stone terrace. The loud scraping noise cut through the polite conversation, drawing everyone's attention. I pulled the chair right up to the center of the head table, wedging it forcefully into the narrow gap directly between my father and Harrison Vance. Charles froze the bottle of wine, hovering mid-air as the red liquid dripped onto the white linen cloth. His eyes bugged out of his head, his face turning an alarming shade of crimson. Harrison simply leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest with a look of absolute terrifying amusement. I sat down smoothly, crossing my legs and folding my hands neatly on the table. I looked past my father's horrified expression and smiled sweetly at Vivian, who was standing frozen in the middle of the terrace. "I wouldn't miss this pitch for the world, Mom." Charles's laughter at the head table abruptly died. His hand froze around the neck of the wine bottle, a single drop of expensive vintage splashing onto the pristine white linen. He stared at me, then at the chair I had dragged with deliberate noise, his face flushing a deep mottled red. Harrison leaned back, steepled his fingers, and watched the interaction with the cool detachment of a judge at an execution. "You cannot sit here." "Hazel," Charles said, his voice dropping into the low, dangerous register he reserved for disobedient children and underperforming employees. "This table is reserved for Vanguard executives and family." "I am both," I replied, picking up a crisp linen napkin and laying it delicately across my lap. Harrison here was just telling me about your Q3 projections. I find your supply chain models fascinating, Dad. I would love to hear you pitch them in person. Charles's eyes narrowed into slits. He set the wine bottle down with a sharp clink, ignoring the Vanguard board members who were now watching our exchange with unabashed curiosity. He leaned forward, attempting to physically block me from Harrison's line of sight, aggressively intruding into my personal space. "Mr. Vance, I must apologize for this interruption," Charles said, his tone shifting into smooth, polished damage control. "My daughter Hazel struggles with appropriate boundaries. We had to let her go from the company several years ago. She was a low-level clerk, mostly data entry, but the pressure of real corporate logistics was simply too much for her. She is not entirely well, if you catch my drift. She has a habit of making grandiose claims when she feels left out of important family moments." He looked at me with an expression of manufactured paternal pity, the kind that made my stomach churn. "I strongly suggest you do not entertain her disruptions," Charles continued, keeping his eyes locked on Harrison. "She tends to invent stories to compensate for her own professional shortcomings. Now, as I was saying about our European distribution network, our staging protocols in Germany have reduced freight loss to practically zero." He gestured to a leather-bound portfolio resting near his plate, likely filled with the doctored, pristine spreadsheets, meant to convince Vanguard his empire was flawless. I did not raise my voice. I did not act offended by his blatant attempt to assassinate my character. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the cold metal of the external drive, and smiled. "That is an impressive claim, Dad," I said, leaning my elbows on the table and turning my attention entirely to the two Vanguard board members sitting across from us, especially considering the recent spikes in offshore shipping failures. I am just a low-level clerk, of course, but I was looking over the industry averages, and I have a few curious questions. Charles's jaw clenched. "Hazel, that is enough. If freight loss is practically zero," I continued, my voice steady, conversational and surgically precise, "how exactly are you offsetting the hidden tariff penalties currently burying your operations in Frankfurt? The staging delays you are logging there, the ones padding your inventory assets, they automatically trigger international holding fees after 24 hours. I saw the exact moment the Vanguard board members shifted in their seats, their professional interest instantly piqued. They were sharks, and there was blood in the water. Charles's face tightened, his knuckles turning white where he gripped the edge of the table. "I do not know where you are getting your information, Hazel, but you are confusing basic holding patterns with tariff penalties. You simply do not understand the macro-level architecture of international logistics." "Oh, I think I understand it perfectly," I said, matching his aggressive stare. "For instance, if you were actively holding phantom inventory in those German facilities to artificially inflate your quarterly assets, you would be forced to borrow against freight that does not exist just to cover your operational deficits. And if those deficits reach, say, $500,000, you might find yourself desperate enough to patch the hole with unauthorized liquid assets." The silence at the head table was immediate and suffocating. The clatter of silverware and the hum of conversation from the rest of the terrace faded into a dull, distant roar. Harrison did not move, his eyes fixed on Charles's rapidly paling face. The Vanguard board members leaned forward, their expressions hardening. "Phantom inventory is a serious accusation, Ms. Vance," one of the men said, his tone entirely devoid of the previous dinner party warmth. "I am not accusing anyone," I replied smoothly, picking up my water glass. "I am simply trying to understand the math. If a company is burning $500,000 a quarter on hidden tariffs, their entire valuation model is a fiction. I was just wondering how a flawless supply chain manages that kind of hemorrhaging without someone noticing." Charles stood up. The movement was so violent and sudden that his heavy wooden chair tipped backward and crashed onto the stone terrace. He slammed his fist down onto the white linen, rattling the crystal glasses and drawing the shocked attention of every single guest within earshot. "You have no idea what you are talking about," he roared, the last shreds of his polished high society facade disintegrating completely. His face was a terrifying mottled purple, his chest heaving with uncontrolled rage. You are a bitter, jealous failure who could not stand to see her sister succeed. Peyton designed this company's architecture. Peyton built the predictive algorithms that run our entire network. The software belongs to Peyton. I set my water glass down. I looked up at the man who had stolen my life's work, who had fired me, locked me out, and spent a decade convincing the world I was insane. I did not shrink. I did not flinch. I smiled. Does it, Dad? I reached into my black leather tote bag resting beside my chair and pulled out a slim silver iPad. I tapped the screen, bringing up the master file I had prepared during the helicopter ride. I did not bother addressing my father. I turned the screen directly toward Harrison and the two Vanguard board members. I swiped my finger across the glass, activating a wireless connection to the large, flat-screen monitor mounted on the stone wall behind the head table, previously displaying a looping slideshow of Peyton and Cameron's engagement photos. The screen flickered, cutting off a picture of my sister, laughing on a yacht, replacing it with a stark, high-resolution scan of a legal document. It was a United States Patent and Trademark Certificate. The text was large, bold, and entirely undeniable. I stood up, adjusting the cuffs of my black jumpsuit, letting the silence stretch until the tension in the air was practically vibrating. You see, Charles is right about one thing, I announced, projecting my voice so it carried across the dead-quiet terrace. The predictive logistics algorithm running his entire European distribution network is absolutely brilliant. It cuts shipping delays by 40% and reduces overall overhead by millions of dollars. It is the sole reason Vanguard Holdings is sitting at this table, offering a $50 million corporate buyout. I walked slowly around the table, standing directly beneath the glowing monitor. But Charles is wrong about the ownership. I continued, pointing to the bottom of the digital document. My father filed a patent application naming Peyton as the sole creator and chief executive of technology 10 years ago, but he fundamentally misunderstood the software he was stealing. The core logic, the proprietary code that makes the entire system function, is legally copyrighted and deeply encrypted under an independent LLC. An LLC that I registered, funded, and legally secured 18 months before he ever saw the final build. I turned to face the crowd, letting my eyes sweep over the sea of shocked, affluent guests. Peyton did not write a single line of that code, I stated, my voice echoing off the stone walls of the villa. Peyton has never written a line of code in her life. She is a fraud. The collective gasp from the wedding guests sounded like a sudden rush of wind. Whispers erupted instantly, rippling through the crowd as hundreds of eyes darted between the patent on the screen, my father's horrified face, and Peyton, who was sitting at the far end of the table, looking as though the ground had just opened up and swallowed her whole. Cameron slowly turned to look at his fiancée. The arrogant, comfortable smirk he had worn all evening was completely gone, replaced by an expression of sheer, unadulterated horror. He was looking at a woman who had just been stripped of her genius, her title, and her impending $50 million payout. He was looking at a woman who could no longer fund his luxury lifestyle. Peyton's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She looked at Charles silently, begging him to fix it, to deploy the gaslighting and the threats that had always kept me in line. But Charles was staring at the Vanguard executives, watching his entire empire burn to ash in real time. Vanguard Holdings cannot buy this company, I informed the board members, returning to my seat and picking up my napkin. Because Charles does not actually own the software he is selling. You are looking at a shell company propped up by stolen intellectual property and phantom assets. Vivian, desperate to save the impending marriage and the only lifeline their family had left, lunged forward. She grabbed a heavy silver tray full of champagne flutes from a paralyzed waiter and hurled it toward the stone floor. The shattering glass and the explosive sound were a frantic, pathetic attempt to create a massive distraction to break the focus of the room. But as the crystal shattered around our feet, I did not look at Vivian. I looked at Peyton. She wasn't looking at the broken glass. She was looking at me, her eyes dark, calculating, and entirely devoid of panic. The initial shock had faded, replaced by a cold, dangerous realization. She was not going to let me destroy her wedding, or her payout. She was going to eliminate the threat before the final contracts were supposed to be signed tomorrow. The waitstaff scrambled to clean up the mess Vivian had made on the terrace, their brooms and dustpans clattering loudly against the stone. The loud distraction gave my father exactly what he needed to call an abrupt end to the dinner service. Charles stood up, his face still flushed but his voice dripping with forced joviality, and announced that the evening would continue inside at the villa private bar. The Vanguard executives, sensing the volatile shift in the atmosphere, quickly excused themselves, citing the early schedule for tomorrow. The remaining wedding guests, buzzing with gossip, filed off the terrace and moved toward the glowing French doors of the main house. Harrison stayed close to my side as we walked inside. The bar area was an opulent space, with dark mahogany-paneled walls, plush velvet seating, and a massive marble counter where two bartenders were already pouring expensive spirits. The room was loud, filled with the nervous chatter of my extended family and Peyton wealthy friends. I stood near a towering indoor ficus plant, sipping a glass of sparkling water, watching the room. Peyton had retreated to a corner booth with Cameron, but she was not talking to him. She was staring at me. Her gaze was completely detached, analyzing me like a problem that required a permanent solution. I saw her whisper something to Cameron, who looked pale and sweaty, clearly still reeling from the revelation that his future wife was not the tech billionaire he thought she was. Peyton stood up and made her way toward the marble bar. I tracked her movements carefully. She leaned over the counter, speaking quietly to one of the bartenders, and ordered 2 glasses of vintage red wine. The bartender turned his back to retrieve the bottles. In that split second, Peyton reached into her small, beaded clutch. I watched her pull out a tiny amber prescription bottle. She uncapped it with her thumb and swiftly tapped a heavy dose of white powder into one of the empty crystal goblets waiting on the counter. The powder dissolved instantly. The bartender turned back, filled both glasses with dark red wine, and Peyton handed him a generous cash tip. She picked up both glasses and turned around, pasting a look of sisterly contrition onto her face. She was walking straight toward me. She intended to hand me the spiked glass, wait for the heavy sedative to hit my bloodstream, and then use my resulting disorientation to prove to the remaining guests and the villa security that I was mentally unstable. She wanted me dragged out of the venue, discredited and incapacitated, ensuring I could not interfere with the final contract signing tomorrow morning. But Peyton had failed to account for Harrison. He had been standing a few feet away, engaged in a polite conversation with my uncle, but his sharp eyes missed absolutely nothing. As Peyton approached me, extending the glass of poisoned wine with a fake apologetic smile, Harrison moved. He stepped seamlessly between us, his broad shoulders completely blocking my sister path. "Peyton," he said, his voice deep and smooth, radiating an effortless charm that immediately disarmed her. What a lovely gesture. But Hazel and I were just discussing how much we preferred the Pinot Noir from the southern vineyards. He reached out and smoothly took the spiked glass right out of her hand. Peyton froze, her smile faltering, as she tried to maintain her grip on the crystal stem, but Harrison was already pulling it away. He did not give her a chance to protest. He turned his attention to Cameron, who had just walked up behind Peyton, looking miserable and desperately in need of a drink. "Cameron," my friend Harrison said, clapping a heavy hand on the younger man's shoulder, "you look like you could use this more than we could." Harrison shoved the spiked glass of red wine directly into Cameron's hand. Cameron, eager for any kind of distraction from his crumbling financial future, did not hesitate. He raised the glass and took a massive gulping swallow, draining half the wine in a single breath. Peyton's face drained of all color. She reached out her hand, hovering in the air, but it was too late. The sedative was already in his system. Harrison turned back to me, offering a subtle, knowing wink, and guided me away from the bar and toward the seating area. We sat down on a velvet sofa, waiting for the inevitable chemistry to take its course. 10 minutes later, the effects of the heavy prescription sedative hit Cameron like a freight train. Peyton had been frantically trying to steer him toward the exit, but Cameron's legs were turning to rubber. He stumbled away from her, his eyes rolling back in his head. Peyton, desperate to salvage the situation and stick to her original plan, suddenly pointed her finger at me from across the room. "Look at Hazel!" Peyton shouted, her voice shrill and hysterical, trying to draw the room attention away from her failing fiancé. "She is acting erratic again. She needs help. Someone call security before she hurts herself. She is completely out of control." But nobody was looking at me. I was sitting quietly on the velvet sofa holding my sparkling water. Everyone was looking at Cameron. He swayed violently, his arms flailing as he tried to find his balance. He let out a loud, slurred groan, took 2 uncoordinated steps backward, and collided heavily with the massive dessert table. He collapsed face first into a towering 5-foot pyramid of expensive imported French macarons. The entire structure toppled over with a spectacular crash, burying the wealthy groom under a mountain of crushed pastry and sticky buttercream. Cameron hit the marble floor and did not move, completely sedated and snoring loudly. The bar erupted into total anarchy. Guests screamed and jumped out of the way. My uncle dropped his drink. Peyton stood frozen in horror, her hands covering her mouth, as she realized her plan had just publicly humiliated the very man she was trying to secure. The bartenders rushed out from behind the counter, shouting in Italian, and someone immediately called for paramedics. In the midst of the screaming and the chaos, I stood up and moved toward the edge of the room. Harrison stayed close behind me, making sure we were clear of the frantic crowd pressing in around Cameron. As I scanned the panicked faces, a flash of movement near the back hallway caught my eye. It was Vivian. While her daughter was crying over her unconscious fiancé and the guests were shouting for medical assistance, my mother was slipping away from the party. She was holding a heavy, locked metal briefcase tightly against her chest, glancing over her shoulder with a look of pure, concentrated paranoia. She pushed through the heavy wooden doors that led out to the dark, expansive gardens surrounding the villa. The sheer desperation in her posture told me everything I needed to know. She was trying to secure the physical leverage they still had left. I did not say a word to Harrison. I simply turned and followed my mother out into the night, slipping through the heavy wooden doors and letting the cool night air wash over my face as I stepped into the shadows to track her movements. The gravel path crunched softly beneath my shoes, the sound completely masked by the wailing siren of a fast-approaching ambulance echoing across the dark lake. I lost her in the labyrinth of the villa's expansive gardens that night, the heavy metal briefcase disappearing into the thick manicured hedges. But the cold dawn brought a very harsh, unavoidable reality. The morning of the wedding arrived, with a thick, heavy fog rolling off the lake, casting a pale gray light over the estate. The frantic energy from the previous night had settled into a grim, tense silence. I walked out into the private rose garden just after sunrise, the damp grass soaking the hem of my trousers. The air felt unnaturally still, the kind of quiet that always precedes a devastating storm. The fragrant scent of blooming flowers was heavy and suffocating. I needed a moment of absolute peace before the final brutal confrontation I knew was inevitably coming. I did not have to wait long. The crunch of aggressive footsteps on the gravel path alerted me before I even saw them. I turned around to find Charles, Vivian, and Peyton blocking the only exit from the sunken garden. The immaculate high society facade they had maintained for decades was entirely gone, stripped away by the panic of their impending financial ruin. They looked feral, desperate, and unspeakably dangerous. Charles' tie was loosened, his expensive jacket wrinkled, and his eyes were bloodshot from a sleepless night of frantic damage control. Vivian's hair was disheveled, the elegant updo she wore the night before, now a chaotic tangle. Her hands balled into tight, shaking fists at her sides. Peyton looked like a cornered animal, still wearing her stained clothes from the bar, her face pale drawn and completely stripped of her usual arrogant glow. They moved toward me in unison, their footsteps deliberate and heavy, backing me up against a high stone wall covered in climbing white roses. There was no escape, and they knew it. The trap was set, but this time I was fully prepared. I had anticipated every single move they would make against me. "Give me the external drive," Hazel Charles demanded, his voice a low, gravelly bark that echoed sharply in the damp morning air. "I know exactly what you did. I know you broke into my server and downloaded the unedited ledgers. Hand it over right now and we can handle this quietly." I crossed my arms over my chest, meeting his bloodshot eyes without a single trace of fear. Or what, Dad? You will just fire me again. You will lock me out of the building and call security. You do not have any leverage left to threaten me with. I saw the real numbers. I saw the offshore accounts, the hidden tariffs, and the phantom inventory. Vanguard is going to tear your company apart the moment they realize your entire valuation is based on fraudulent bookkeeping. Charles let out a harsh, humorless laugh that sounded more like a cough. He took another step forward, actively invading my personal space, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me the way he always had when I was a child. He glared down at me, his jaw set in a rigid line of absolute contempt. "You think you are so brilliant?" He sneered, his face mere inches from mine. "You think you figured it all out like some kind of corporate hero?" We needed a fall guy, Hazel. The company was hemorrhaging cash, and the international auditors were getting far too close to the truth. We needed someone entirely expendable to take the blame for the missing funds. And since you were the useless daughter who brought absolutely no social value to this family, you were the logical choice to sacrifice. The sheer, unvarnished cruelty of his words hung heavily in the cold morning air. He was openly admitting it, confirming every dark suspicion I had harbored since the moment the Italian authorities detained me. He had personally planted the stolen diamonds in my bag. He had meticulously framed me for embezzlement. He had let me sit in an Italian holding cell, fully prepared to let me go to a foreign prison, just to protect his own fraudulent empire and ensure Peyton's wedding went off without a hitch. "You set up your own daughter," I stated, keeping my voice dangerously quiet and composed. "You planted stolen diamonds in my luggage to save yourself. You forced our hand!" Vivian screamed, stepping forward to stand directly beside her husband. Her face was twisted with an ugly, self-righteous fury, completely oblivious to the monstrous nature of their actions. "You refused to just quietly support your sister's success. You were always so difficult, always asking irritating questions, always refusing to be a compliant team player. If you had just stayed in the basement and kept your mouth shut like a good employee, none of this extreme discipline would have been necessary. You brought this entirely on yourself by trying to outshine Peyton and ruin her perfect moment." Peyton let out a high, hysterical sob, her composure completely shattering. "You are a monster, Hazel," she shrieked, pointing a trembling, accusing finger directly at my chest. "You ruined my entire wedding week. You ruined my rehearsal dinner. Cameron will not even look at me." The paramedics pumped him full of fluids, and the moment he woke up, he started screaming about my fake algorithm and his empty trust fund. "You destroyed the $50 million Vanguard deal. You ruined my life, and you enjoyed doing it." I looked at the three of them, this toxic, parasitic trinity that had spent my entire existence trying to make me feel small, worthless, and fundamentally insane. The crippling social anxiety that used to paralyze me in their domineering presence was completely gone. I felt nothing but a cold, absolute, and overwhelming clarity. "I did not ruin anything, Peyton," I replied, my voice remarkably steady and completely devoid of any sympathetic emotion. "I just turned on the lights. You three built a fragile, precarious house of cards, and you are angry at me because the wind finally blew it down." Charles slammed his heavy hand against the stone wall right next to my head, sending a violent shower of white rose petals fluttering down to the damp ground. His face was a deep, terrifying purple with rage, a thick vein pulsing dangerously in his thick neck. "I am not playing silly corporate games with you anymore, Hazel," he roared, angry spit flying from his lips. "You are going to sign over the legal rights to that logistics algorithm right now. You are going to transfer the LLC ownership directly to Peyton's name, and you are going to hand over the flash drive with the unedited ledgers before Harrison wakes up. And if I refuse, I challenge tilting my chin up and refusing to break eye contact." Charles smiled, a dark, malicious curling of his lips that sent a chill down my spine. "If you refuse, I will make a single phone call to the American Auditing Board. I still have high-level connections, Hazel. Powerful friends who owe me massive favors. I will tell them you stole proprietary company code. I will legally frame you for corporate espionage. I will drag your professional name through the mud until you are federally indicted. You will never work in finance again. You will be blacklisted, ruined, and completely bankrupt. You will be absolutely nothing. Sign the transfer papers right now. Hazel or I will systematically destroy your entire future before you even leave this garden." The wealthy elite stood completely paralyzed by the raw, unscripted implosion of their favorite golden couple. Harrison placed a warm, steady hand on the small of my back, a silent anchor amidst the chaos. He simply guided me through the parted sea of gaping guests, leading me out of the ballroom and into the cool, quiet Italian night. We left Charles frantically signaling the waitstaff to cut the microphone power, while Vivian lunged forward to shield her hyperventilating daughter from the whispers already spreading like wildfire. The next evening arrived with a heavy tension. We had relocated to a private suite that Harrison had secured for his executive team. I was sitting at a glass dining table with a cup of black espresso when Harrison walked into the room. He had already been awake for hours, projecting a dangerous energy. He set his phone face down on the glass table and took the seat across from me. "Your father is panicking," Harrison said, his voice a low rumble. "Charles is trying to accelerate the timeline. He knows the stunt you pulled last night exposed a massive crack in their facade. He realizes that if Vanguard starts digging into Cameron-depleted trust fund, we might start digging deeper into the logistics company too. He is terrified of losing his lifeline." I took a slow sip of the bitter espresso. "So what is his move?" "He is leveraging his relationships with two of my oldest board members, trying to completely bypass our standard final audit period," Harrison explained. "He is demanding that we sign the preliminary buyout contracts tonight at the exclusive rehearsal dinner, framing it as a symbolic gesture of unity before the wedding. If I refuse to sign in front of all those witnesses, he will spin it to the board as a personal insult and walk away retaining his victim status. If I do sign, Vanguard is legally bound and he gets an immediate cash infusion that covers his tracks. He wants to corner you into signing before you can officially find the missing $500,000, I said. "Exactly," Harrison said. "Right now, all I have is a strong suspicion and a bag of confiscated diamonds sitting in an Italian customs evidence locker. Suspicion is not enough to breach a corporate contract of this magnitude. I need the absolute undeniable proof of his embezzlement before I sit down at that head table tonight." Charles was arrogant. When he stole my software, he simply slapped a new interface over my original code. He was likely still using the same server infrastructure to hide his dirty numbers. "I need your computer," I said, "and the password to the Villa network." He would keep an encrypted backup on a drive routed through whatever network he is connected to. Harrison slid his laptop across the glass and typed in the credentials. I bypassed the primary firewall and located the server Charles established for his personal devices. The front door was guarded, but years ago I coded an invisible backdoor into the registry using the Wi-Fi network I set up for him. He never knew it existed. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing the buried command lines. A terminal window popped open. A cursor blinked twice, and the system granted me unrestricted administrative access. "I am in," I whispered, opening the master directory. I bypassed the polished fake reports meant for Vanguard and dug straight into the raw, unedited ledgers. It took me less than 10 minutes to find the exact paper trail of the $500,000 diamond smuggling scheme. Buried under dummy corporations, exactly $500,000 had been bled out of the operating budget. Right next to that deficit was a forged transit manifest for industrial drill bits routed through Milan, matching the exact carat weight of the diamonds Peyton slipped into my bag. I downloaded the entire payload, transferring the unedited ledgers and the forged transit manifests onto a secure external drive. I pulled the drive free and held it up, the small piece of metal catching the light. "I have the bullet," I said. Harrison let out a slow, deeply satisfied breath. A predatory smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Then let us go to a dinner party." The rehearsal dinner was held on the lower terrace of the villa, situated right at the edge of the dark lake. Strings of fairy lights were woven through the olive trees, casting a soft glow over round tables draped in white linen. A head table was positioned at the far end of the terrace, clearly reserved for family and Vanguard executives. I arrived a few minutes after the guests had taken their seats. I wore a sleek, tailored black jumpsuit that felt like armor, my hair pulled back into a severe twist. The moment my heels clicked against the stone terrace, Vivian materialized out of the crowd like a heat-seeking missile. She wore a forced, tight smile, her eyes darting nervously toward Harrison, who was already standing near the head table conversing with his board members. She stepped directly into my path, physically blocking my progression through the tables. "Hazel, darling!" Vivian cooed, her voice pitched to sound like a loving mother. She grasped my forearms, squeezing hard enough to leave bruises. Her smile never wavered, but her voice dropped into a venomous hiss. "You made your point last night. But tonight is about business, and you are not going to ruin this for us." She gestured toward the very back of the terrace near the kitchen doors. Sitting at a poorly lit table in the corner were my 4 teenage cousins, completely ignoring the event. "I have arranged a special spot just for you," Vivian continued, dripping with condescension as she tried to herd me backward. "You will be much more comfortable back there with the younger kids, far away from all the boring corporate talk. You just sit quietly, eat your dinner, and let the adults handle the real work." I did not move. I stared down at the woman who had spent my entire life trying to make me small, feeling the metallic edge of the external drive pressing against the inside of my pocket. I did not argue with her. I smoothly stepped around her outstretched hand and walked directly past the bewildered guests, ignoring Vivian, desperate gasp behind me. I marched straight up to the head table where Charles was currently holding court, pouring vintage red wine for 2 of the Vanguard board members. I grabbed a heavy carved wooden chair from an adjacent table and dragged it across the stone terrace. The loud scraping noise cut through the polite conversation, drawing everyone's attention. I pulled the chair right up to the center of the head table, wedging it forcefully into the narrow gap directly between my father and Harrison Vance. Charles immediately froze in place, the heavy glass bottle of expensive vintage wine hovering mid-air as the dark red liquid slowly dripped onto the pristine white linen cloth. Harrison simply leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest with a look of absolute terrifying amusement. I sat down smoothly, crossing my legs and folding my hands neatly on the wooden table. I looked past my father's horrified expression and smiled sweetly at Vivian, who was standing completely frozen in the exact middle of the open terrace. I definitely wouldn't miss this pitch for the world, Mom. The threat hung in the damp morning air, heavy and sharp. Charles kept his aggressive stance, his chest heaving, waiting for the familiar sight of my submission. He expected my shoulders to drop. He expected my eyes to lower to the wet grass. He expected the terrified, obedient daughter to resurface and surrender to his absolute authority. I simply looked at him, completely unmoved by the venom in his voice. The absolute lack of fear in my expression must have registered because his confident sneer began to falter. The silence stretched between us thick with unspoken finality. Vivian saw the hesitation in her husband. She saw that the brutal intimidation tactics that had governed our family dynamics for my entire life were suddenly entirely ineffective. Her eyes darted wildly between my unwavering stare and Charles' tense jaw. Realizing that raw anger was failing to secure their salvation, Vivian executed a flawless, instantaneous shift in strategy. The venomous attacking mother vanished. In her place, a desperate, broken woman materialized. Vivian let out a strangled, theatrical sob and collapsed right there on the wet gravel path. She fell to her knees, the damp earth soaking immediately into the fabric of her expensive designer trousers. She covered her face with her trembling hands, her shoulders heaving with manufactured despair. "Hazel, please!" Vivian wailed, her voice cracking with hysterical practiced sorrow. "Please stop this. Look at what you are doing to us. Look at what you are doing to your family." She crawled forward on her knees, her hands reaching out to grasp the fabric of my dark trousers. I took a deliberate step backward, refusing to let her touch me. Vivian looked up, tears streaming down her carefully made-up face, her mascara smudging perfectly to convey maximum distress. "I gave birth to you," Vivian sobbed, clutching her hands against her chest as if she were in physical agony. "I raised you. We gave you everything a child could possibly want. How can you be so cold? How can you destroy your own blood like this? We are your family, Hazel. Your only family. We are begging you. Just sign the paper, please, for me. Do it for your mother. I stared down at the woman weeping on the gravel. I waited for the familiar wave of guilt to wash over me. I waited for the crushing weight of daughterly obligation to force my hand the same way it always had when I was a teenager desperately trying to earn her love. But looking at her now, all I felt was a profound clinical detachment. Her tears were completely transparent. Her heartbreak was a carefully deployed weapon designed solely to protect her wealth and her social status. "You did not give me everything I wanted, Mom," I said, my voice cutting through her hysterical sobs with absolute calm. "You gave me conditional survival. You gave me a roof over my head as long as I accepted being the invisible defective background character to Peyton Golden performance. And the moment that performance was threatened, you both gladly threw me to the wolves." I shifted my gaze from my weeping mother to my father, who was watching me with a mixture of confusion and mounting dread. "You think you have leverage because of what happened at the airport in Milan?" I continued, keeping my tone strictly conversational. "You think that because Italian customs found a fortune in uncut diamonds in my luggage, you hold some ultimate destructive power over my life. You actually believe that sacrificing me to foreign authorities would buy you enough time to close the Vanguard deal and patch the $500,000 hole in your operating budget." Charles crossed his arms, his posture rigid. "We do have that power, Hazel. The authorities have the stones, but I have the paperwork to prove they belong to your personal LLC. I can tie you to that smuggling operation with one phone call." I let out a slow, genuine laugh. The sound echoed brightly against the high stone walls of the rose garden, startling a pair of doves from the nearby hedges. Peyton flinched, stepping closer to her father, her eyes wide with paranoid confusion. "You really should learn to check your stones, Dad," I said, shaking my head with a mixture of pity and amusement. Charles dropped his arms. "What are you talking about? Did you honestly believe I was completely blind to your financial maneuvering?" I asked, taking a slow step toward him. "Months ago, long before you ever announced this ridiculous destination wedding, I was looking over the public records for your logistics firm. It is a habit of mine. I like to keep track of the company I helped build. I noticed the revenue discrepancies immediately. Your staging delays in Germany were triggering massive hidden tariff penalties, but your offshore accounts were not reflecting the cash burn. I knew you were hiding assets. I knew you were looking for a way to liquidate something untraceable to cover your tracks." Vivian stopped crying. She slowly lowered her hands from her face, remaining perfectly still on the damp gravel as the truth began to unfold. "So I paid a visit to the house while you and Mom were out at one of your charity galas," I explained, watching the blood drain completely from my father's face. "You have always used the same numeric combination for the wall safe in your study. It was my mother's birthday, which is surprisingly sentimental for a man who views his family as expendable assets. I opened the safe expecting to find offshore bank routing numbers or forged ledgers. Instead, I found a velvet pouch holding $500,000 worth of uncut, untraceable diamonds." Peyton let out a sharp, panicked breath. "You broke into the safe." "I did much more than break in," I said, turning my attention to my sister. I knew exactly what Charles was planning to do with those stones. I knew he was going to use the wedding trip as a cover to move them across international borders and liquidate them in Europe to save his failing company. So I made a trip to the jewelry district downtown. I purchased a very specific collection of high-quality industrial-grade cubic zirconias. They were perfectly cut to match the exact carat weight and visual clarity of your precious smuggled stones. Charles' mouth fell open, his eyes darting frantically back and forth as he tried to process the magnitude of what I was saying. "I swapped them," I stated clearly, letting the absolute finality of the words sink into their panicked minds. "I took the real diamonds out of your safe and I left the cubic zirconias in their place. You did not plant $500,000 worth of precious gems in my luggage to save your company. You planted literal pieces of worthless glass. You risked my freedom, my life, and my future for absolutely nothing." Peyton shrieked. It was a visceral, horrifying sound of pure, unadulterated panic. She grabbed the sides of her head, her fingers digging wildly into her messy hair as she stumbled backward against the climbing roses. She looked at her father, her face contorted in an ugly mask of terror. "You idiot!" Peyton screamed at Charles, her voice cracking with hysteria. "You put fake stones in her bag! You lost the real diamonds!" But I am not finished. I continued, raising my voice to easily overpower Peyton's shrieking. "I did not just keep the real diamonds. I am an auditor, Dad. I follow the law." The morning after I swapped the stones, I walked directly into the local field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I handed the real diamonds over to a federal agent, along with a highly detailed file outlining your phantom inventory, your hidden tariffs, and your obvious intent to commit international smuggling. Vivian let out a low, breathless moan and slumped forward onto the gravel, completely defeated. "The FBI has had the real stones for months," I informed them, enjoying the absolute devastation radiating from my father. "They have been quietly investigating your logistics company ever since. They were just waiting for you to attempt the smuggling run to officially trigger the federal indictment. When Italian customs detained me in Milan, they flagged the glass stones and contacted the American authorities. The federal investigation is already fully active. There is no deal to save you. There is no buyout that will cover this up. You are entirely out of moves." Peyton began to hyperventilate, clutching her chest as she slid down the stone wall, her pristine facade completely obliterated by the reality of her impending criminal ruin. I waited for Charles to collapse. I expected him to fall to his knees right alongside my mother and beg for mercy. I expected the realization of federal prison to finally break his arrogant spirit. But Charles did not fall. He stood perfectly still for a long moment, staring at the wet gravel near his expensive shoes. Then slowly he raised his head. His eyes were cold hard and terrifyingly clear. He sneered a dark, triumphant expression that completely erased his previous panic. "It does not matter," Charles said, his voice dropping back into a calm, deadly authority. He stepped over Vivian, completely ignoring his weeping wife on the ground, and walked right up to me. "You think you are so clever with your little FBI stunt?" Charles continued, a vicious smile spreading across his face. "But you are forgetting one crucial detail about how the real world operates. The Vanguard CEO is arriving at the villa in exactly 1 hour. Harrison Vance might be running the acquisition, but the CEO has the final signature authority. And Vanguard does not care about your petty moral victories. They care about the algorithm. Once we sign the buyout this morning, we will have $50 million in liquid cash. We will have enough money to hire the best defense attorneys on the planet. We will have enough cash to bury your little federal investigation forever. You lose." I did not offer a rebuttal to my father's delusional declaration of victory. I simply looked at the three of them standing there in the damp rose garden, clinging desperately to a lifeline that did not actually exist. Charles was breathing heavily, his chest puffed out with the manufactured confidence of a man who believed money could buy his way out of federal prosecution. Vivian was scrambling to her feet, hastily brushing the wet gravel from her designer trousers, her face twisting back into a mask of arrogant superiority. Peyton let out a shaky breath and wiped her tear-stained cheeks, clearly relieved by her father's promise of salvation. They genuinely believed they had outmaneuvered me. They believed the impending corporate buyout would wash away their sins and secure their flawless high society future. I did not correct them. I simply turned my back on my family and walked out of the garden, leaving them to their toxic delusions. The hours leading up to the evening festivities passed in a surreal, suffocating blur. The wedding ceremony itself took place late in the afternoon on the sprawling, manicured lawns overlooking the shimmering lake. I stood near the back of the white wooden chairs watching the theatrical performance unfold. The floral arrangements were breathtaking, cascading archways of imported white orchids and pale pink peonies framing the altar. A classical string quartet played softly in the background, providing a beautiful soundtrack to an entirely fractured union. Cameron stood at the altar looking absolutely miserable. He was still incredibly pale and groggy from the heavy prescription sedative Peyton had intended for me the night before. He swayed slightly on his feet, sweating under the collar of his custom-tailored tuxedo, his eyes glazed and unfocused. When Peyton glided down the aisle in her custom silk gown projecting the image of a blushing, radiant bride, Cameron barely managed to muster a weak, obligatory smile. There was no love in his expression, only a trapped, suffocated resignation. He knew he was marrying a fraud, but the promise of a $50 million payout kept him tethered to the altar. They exchanged their hollow vows, sealed their deeply compromised relationship with a stiff kiss, and turned to face the cheering crowd of wealthy elites. The lavish wedding reception began immediately afterward on the grand upper terrace of the villa. The transition from daylight to early evening brought a cool breeze off the water, causing the hundreds of floating candles suspended above the dining tables to flicker and dance. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of expensive champagne and delicate caviar hors d'oeuvres. The orchestra shifted from somber classical pieces to lively, upbeat jazz, filling the air with a celebratory energy that sharply contrasted the dark reality threatening to consume the hosting family. Charles and Vivian were standing near the massive, sweeping head table, playing their roles with practiced, flawless perfection. They smiled broadly, clinking glasses with international shipping magnates and wealthy socialites, projecting an aura of absolute invincibility. Charles kept checking his heavy gold wristwatch, his eyes darting toward the main gates of the estate. He was waiting eagerly for the Vanguard legal team to arrive. He wanted to sign the preliminary corporate contracts right here in the middle of the reception, turning his daughter's wedding into a massive public display of his own business prowess. He wanted to cement his status in front of his high society friends, proving to the world that his empire was expanding. He believed that securing that signature would instantly validate his worth and provide the immediate cash infusion needed to bury the federal investigation I had triggered. I sat quietly at a small table near the edge of the terrace, sipping a glass of sparkling water and watching my father perform. He was currently gripping the shoulder of a prominent Italian politician, laughing loudly at a joke and gesturing toward the expansive villa grounds. I could see the nervous tension tightening the corners of his eyes, the subtle tremor in his hands when he reached for his wine glass. He was desperate for the Vanguard executives to appear. He needed the validation of that $50 million contract to soothe the terrifying reality of the FBI knocking on his corporate doors back in America. Vivian was equally frantic beneath her polished exterior. She fluttered between tables, adjusting centerpieces and sharply whispering orders to the catering staff, ensuring every single detail was picture-perfect for the impending arrival of the billionaires who were going to save their lives. She paused briefly to glance in my direction, shooting me a look of pure, venomous triumph. She truly believed they had won. She believed that my attempts to hold them accountable were nothing more than the bitter flailing of a jealous daughter easily neutralized by their superior wealth and influence. Peyton and Cameron were seated at the center of the head table, flanked by towering arrangements of white roses. Peyton was forcing a radiant smile, posing for photographs, and accepting the gushing congratulations of her wealthy friends. Cameron sat rigidly beside her, occasionally rubbing his temples and drinking heavily from a glass of bourbon, completely ignoring his new bride. The entire scene was a masterpiece of superficial perfection, a beautiful glittering shell covering a rotting core. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting the terrace in a deep, velvety twilight. The orchestra transitioned into a smooth, elegant waltz, just as a low, synchronized hum echoed from the long gravel driveway leading up to the main villa. The sound grew louder, drawing the attention of the wedding guests near the stone balustrades. A fleet of sleek black SUVs with heavily tinted windows rolled slowly through the wrought iron gates of the estate. The vehicles moved with absolute precision, coming to a smooth halt in the circular courtyard adjacent to the upper terrace. The sudden imposing arrival sent a ripple of excited murmurs through the affluent crowd. Guests paused their conversations, turning to watch as uniformed drivers immediately stepped out and opened the rear doors of the vehicles. Charles's face lit up with a victorious, arrogant smirk. He quickly handed his wine glass to a passing waiter and aggressively smoothed the lapels of his tuxedo jacket. He leaned over and whispered something to Vivian, who immediately brightened, her posture straightening with supreme confidence. The Vanguard legal team had arrived. A group of sharp, intimidating men and women in impeccably tailored dark suits stepped out of the SUVs. They moved together as a cohesive, powerful unit, carrying thick leather briefcases and projecting an aura of absolute corporate dominance. The wedding guests parted instinctively, creating a wide, clear path for the executives as they walked up the wide stone steps toward the terrace. Charles stepped forward to greet them, puffing out his chest and extending his arms in a grand, welcoming gesture. He was fully prepared to embrace the saviors of his fraudulent empire. He was ready to greet the mysterious Vanguard Chief Executive Officer, a man he had only ever spoken to via encrypted email. "Welcome to beautiful Italy, my friends," Charles announced loudly, his voice booming across the quiet terrace. "Let us officially sign the lucrative contract today." The imposing line of corporate lawyers parted smoothly. A tall, broad-shouldered figure finally stepped forward into the light. The man leading the Vanguard legal team was Harrison, the supposed low-level representative I had brought. The collective breath of the room seemed to vanish. Charles froze with his arms raised. His confident smile faltered, replaced by a twitch of profound confusion. He looked over Harrison's shoulder, waiting for the real chief executive officer to step out from the shadows of the SUVs. He believed Harrison was just an assistant clearing the path. But the towering lawyers in their immaculate dark suits did not step around Harrison. They flanked him. They moved with a practiced rhythm, falling into step slightly behind him, their posture projecting absolute subordination. Charles lowered his arms slowly. He blinked his eyes, trying to make sense of the unfolding scene. Vivian let out a soft, confused sound. The wealthy guests began to murmur among themselves. Harrison did not even glance at my father. He walked past Charles with the effortless grace of a man who owned the very ground he was stepping on. He bypassed the head table, moving directly toward the raised marble platform where the orchestra was playing. He climbed the short flight of steps, his presence commanding so much authority that the musicians instinctively slowed. Harrison raised a single steady hand. The conductor immediately lowered his baton. The orchestra cut out abruptly. The silence was deafening. Harrison walked over to the microphone stand at the center of the platform. He adjusted the height with a deliberate motion. He looked out over the sea of affluent guests, his gaze sweeping across the glowing terrace, before finally locking directly onto my father. Charles was practically vibrating with nervous energy, his hands clutching the edge of the head table. "Good evening, Harrison," said his resonant voice echoing through the sound system. "I apologize for interrupting the festivities, but as Charles pointed out, there is also a significant matter of business to conclude. And I believe in handling corporate acquisitions with complete transparency." Harrison paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the crowd. "For those of you I have not yet had the pleasure of meeting, officially," Harrison continued, his voice projecting with effortless command, "I am Harrison Vance, Chief Executive Officer and founder of Vanguard Holdings." The shockwave that hit the terrace was immediate and physical. Charles reeled backward as if he had been struck in the chest. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin an ashen gray. His fingers went slack. The heavy champagne glass he had retrieved slipped from his grasp. It plummeted toward the ground and hit the marble floor with a sharp crash. Charles did not even look down. The man he had been trying to corner, the man he had been aggressively attempting to manipulate all evening, was the billionaire who held his entire future in his hands. He was looking at the executioner he had invited into his own home. Vivian let out a strangled, high-pitched gasp. She slapped both hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with absolute terror. She took a stumbling step backward, her silk gown rustling loudly as she leaned heavily against the table for support. She was looking at the man she had actively dismissed, the man she had treated as a disposable +1. Her perfectly constructed high society world was disintegrating in front of her eyes. At the center of the head table, Peyton looked as though the ground had simply opened up and swallowed her whole. She was staring at Harrison with an expression of panic. Her hands gripped the white tablecloth in white-knuckled terror. She was remembering the welcome party. She was remembering the arrogant, condescending way she had mocked him, the way she had laughed in his face and ridiculed his presence. The devastating realization washed over her. She had insulted the very man holding the $50 million payout she desperately needed to fund her lavish, fraudulent lifestyle. The wedding guests were entirely speechless. The whispers had completely died out, replaced by a collective breathless anticipation. They were sharks, and they could smell the blood pouring into the water. From my isolated vantage point, I watched as my uncle subtly took a step away from my parents, instinctively distancing his own reputation from the toxic fallout. The beautiful floral centerpieces on the table suddenly looked like funeral wreaths. The extravagant, imported champagne, sitting untouched in crystal flutes, seemed to sour in the tense, heavy atmosphere. Every single opulent detail of the wedding reception had instantly transformed into a glittering, undeniably expensive monument to their colossal failure. It was a breathtaking downfall to witness. I remained perfectly still in the dark shadows, my hands resting calmly on the table. For the first time in my life, I was not the target of the room's suffocating judgment. I was the silent observer, watching the people who had terrorized me finally face an opponent they could not gaslight, intimidate, or buy off. The sheer scale of their impending public ruin was staggering. They had spent decades building their entire identity on a foundation of lies, and now the absolute truth was standing on a marble stage, holding a microphone under the bright Italian stars. Harrison ignored the shattered glass at my father's feet. He kept his eyes locked on Charles, his expression shifting from polite charm to cold, calculating corporate detachment. Vanguard Holdings does not simply buy companies. Harrison addressed the captivated crowd, his voice smooth and incredibly dangerous. We acquire legacies. We integrate complex operational networks into our global infrastructure. A $50 million acquisition is not a casual transaction. It requires absolute trust, total transparency, and an immaculate financial record. When we commit to a partnership of this magnitude, we take the auditing process incredibly seriously. We do not rely on preliminary spreadsheets or charming dinner conversations to make our final decisions. Charles was swaying slightly, gripping the back of a chair to keep himself upright. He looked like a man standing on the gallows watching the executioner measure the rope. He knew exactly what Harrison was doing. Harrison was systematically dismantling the narrative Charles had spent months building. Because we demand absolute perfection in our acquisitions, Harrison continued, pacing slowly across the marble stage, we always deploy our own internal teams to verify the numbers. I never enter a final contract signing without the absolute assurance that the company I am buying is exactly what it claims to be. That is why I never travel to a final acquisition without bringing my elite personnel. He looked out into the shadows near the back of the terrace, his eyes finding exactly where I was sitting quietly at my table. I brought my lead forensic auditor to this estate to conduct a thorough, uncompromising review of the logistics network we were preparing to purchase. Harrison said, his voice ringing with absolute pride and unwavering authority. It is a highly specialized job that requires a brilliant mind, an eye for hidden details, and the courage to expose the truth. The stunned crowd began to shift heads, turning to follow Harrison's line of sight. Vivian let out another choked sob, shaking her head. Charles squeezed his eyes shut as if hoping the darkness would make the nightmare disappear. Harrison extended his hand, gesturing openly and respectfully toward the back of the room, cutting a clear path through the sea of affluent guests. Please welcome the brilliant woman who uncovered the truth, Harrison announced, his voice vibrating with absolute triumph. Hazel. I stepped out of the shadows and moved into the warm pool of light spilling from the stage. The heavy silence on the terrace was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic click of my heels against the stone floor. As I walked down the center aisle, I felt the intense burning weight of hundreds of eyes tracking my every movement. I did not rush. I passed Cameron's snobby parents who were clutching their champagne flutes so tightly their knuckles had turned white, staring at me with utter bewilderment. I passed my uncle who had already physically distanced himself from Vivian. I walked right past the head table, ignoring the terrifying shade of purple creeping up my father neck. I climbed the steps onto the marble platform. Harrison offered me a respectful nod and stepped back. I calmly reached into my sleek black tote bag and pulled out my tablet. Without saying a word to the captivated audience, I swiped the glass screen and activated the wireless connection to the massive flat screen monitors mounted behind the head table. A fraction of a second later, the romantic slideshow of Peyton and Cameron engagement photos vanished. The images of my sister were instantly replaced by the stark, undeniable reality of my father's fraudulent empire. High-resolution scans of unredacted ledgers, hidden routing numbers, and deeply buried dummy corporations illuminated the terrace in a harsh light. The collective gasp from the wedding guests sounded like a sudden rush of wind. For the last 10 years, Charles Vance has sold the world a very specific narrative. I began projecting my voice clearly into the microphone. He sold you the image of an unstoppable logistics empire, spearheaded by the brilliant technological mind of his youngest daughter, Peyton. He used that narrative to successfully secure lines of credit to court elite international investors and to fund the lavish lifestyle you are all enjoying tonight. I tapped the screen of my tablet, bringing up a side-by-side comparison of the doctored ledgers meant for Vanguard and the real devastating numbers I had extracted from his hidden server. But that narrative is a complete fiction. I continued, my voice steady. The proprietary software that runs the entire European distribution network, the very algorithm Vanguard Holdings was fully prepared to spend $50 million to acquire, tonight was entirely stolen. Peyton did not write a single line of that code. I did. I registered the intellectual property under an independent LLC 18 months before Charles ever saw the final build. This company does not own its most valuable asset. It is a hollow shell propped up by stolen intellectual property and staggering corporate debt. I let my gaze sweep over the crowd, watching the realization wash over the faces of Cameron parents. Their shifting expressions moved from quiet bewilderment to unadulterated horror as they painfully understood that the incredibly wealthy tech heiress their beloved son had just married was actually completely broke. But intellectual property theft is just the beginning of the deception, I stated. Charles' company has been hemorrhaging massive amounts of cash for years. Incompetent staging protocols in Germany have been triggering hidden tariff penalties, creating a $500,000 deficit in their operating budget every quarter. To hide this catastrophic failure from international auditors, Charles created a massive network of phantom inventory logging false shipments that simply did not exist to artificially inflate the company overall valuation. I tapped my screen again. The monitors flashed, displaying the forged transit manifests alongside the bank records of the offshore accounts. The crowd was completely silent when the corporate auditors started getting too close to the devastating truth. Charles panicked, I explained, looking directly down at my father, who was gripping the edge of the head table so hard his shaking knuckles were stark white. He desperately needed a massive, untraceable cash infusion to patch the bleeding holes in his ledgers. So he took $500,000 out of the operating budget and purchased uncut diamonds. His brilliant plan was to use this very wedding as a convenient cover to safely smuggle those stones across international borders. He intended to liquidate them here in Europe, wash the cash, and save his empire before Vanguard signed the final contracts. Peyton let out a high whimper, her hands flying up to cover her face. To ensure his own safety, Charles planted those diamonds in my luggage, I announced, letting the cold truth strike the crowd. He planned to use me as the fall guy. He fully intended to let me take the heavy blame for international smuggling so he could walk away clean. But he made one critical mistake. I slowly leaned forward, resting my hands heavily on the cold edge of the marble stage. I audited his home safe months ago, I said, my voice dropping into a deadly conversational tone. I found the stones, and I swapped them. The precious diamonds Charles planted in my bag, the absolute fortune he was relying on to save his failing company, were high-quality cubic zirconias. I bought them for a few $100s in the local jewelry district. I took the real diamonds and handed them directly over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation in America, along with a highly detailed file outlining this entire embezzlement scheme. They have been quietly investigating his logistics company ever since. You deliberately risked my freedom and my entire future for pieces of worthless glass. Peyton shrieked in absolute horror. She violently slumped forward onto the head table, burying her face deeply in her arms, as her perfect, luxurious wedding reception devolved into a public crime scene. The wealthy guests erupted into chaotic, panicked whispers. Charles finally snapped. The polished, aristocratic facade he had worn flawlessly for decades completely disintegrated into an ugly mask of pure feral rage. He kicked his chair backward, sending it crashing onto the stone floor, and pointed a trembling, furious finger at me. "Cut the power to those screens!" Charles screamed, his voice cracking. "Get her off that stage right now! Security!" Two Villa security guards stepped forward, but Vanguard heavily muscled private security team immediately blocked the narrow aisles. They had already secured the entire outdoor perimeter. Nobody was touching the power, and absolutely nobody was getting near the stage. I turned to look directly at my father, feeling a profound sense of closure wash over me. "You thought I was alone, Dad?" I said, my voice ringing clearly across the terrified crowd. "You thought I was just the quiet, defective daughter you could push into the shadows and sacrifice whenever it was convenient. But you forgot one crucial thing. I am the one who tracks the money." Charles' chest heaved. He gripped the table, refusing to accept his destruction. "It does not matter," he spat defensively. "The Vanguard CEO is standing right here. Once Harrison signs the buyout tonight, we will have enough cash to bury your federal investigation forever. You lose. Vanguard is definitively not buying your company today," I announced, delivering the absolute final blow to his ego. "Because I legally proved your logistics firm was hopelessly insolvent, Vanguard immediately triggered a massive, unavoidable default clause in your credit agreements. Over the last 48 hours, using the massive profits from my software patent, I personally bought up all your defaulted debts for absolute pennies on the dollar. I own your company, Charles. I own your beautiful house. I own absolutely everything right now." The absolute silence that followed my declaration was heavier than anything I had ever experienced. It was the sound of an entire reality fracturing piece by piece, until nothing remained but the cold, hard truth. I stood on the marble stage, the soft glow of the presentation screens illuminating my face, and watched my father struggle to comprehend the magnitude of his destruction. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The arrogant, untouchable shipping magnate had been entirely stripped of his power. He looked small, fragile, and utterly terrified. I kept my eyes locked on his, refusing to grant him even a fraction of a second of reprieve. I tapped the screen of my tablet one final time. A new document appeared on the massive monitors behind me. It was a consolidated statement of debt ownership officially stamped and verified by international financial regulators. "I am the primary creditor," I stated, my voice echoing evenly across the breathless terrace. "I am officially calling in the debts, Charles. You own absolutely nothing. The company you built on a foundation of lies, the sprawling house back in Chicago, the luxury cars, the offshore accounts you thought were securely hidden, it all legally belongs to me now. Every single asset you possess is forfeit." Charles stumbled backward as if the words had physically struck him. He collided with the edge of the head table, sending a silver platter of caviar crashing to the stone floor. He looked wildly around the terrace, his eyes darting from the glowing screens to the Vanguard legal team, and finally to the hundreds of elite guests who were watching his public execution. He was searching for a lifeline, a friendly face, a business partner who might step forward and intervene. But there was no one. The social collapse was immediate and merciless. The horrified whispers began to ripple through the crowd, growing louder and more frantic by the second. The wealthy socialites and international billionaires who had been toasting my father's health just moments ago were now physically backing away from him. They treated him as though he were suddenly highly contagious. In their world, there was no sin greater than losing your money, except perhaps being publicly exposed as a fraud. I watched Cameron's snobby parents, the people who had looked down their noses at me for my entire life, react to the unfolding disaster. Cameron's mother clutched her diamond necklace, her face flushed with pure, unadulterated outrage. She realized with horrifying clarity that her precious family name was now permanently tied to a massive international smuggling and embezzlement scandal. She turned to her husband, whispering furiously, He did not even bother to reply. He simply turned on his heel and began marching briskly toward the terrace exit, his wife trailing closely behind him. They did not look back at their son. They did not look at the weeping bride. They simply abandoned the sinking ship with practiced, ruthless efficiency. Cameron remained frozen at the head table. The heavy prescription sedative Peyton had given him was clearly wearing off, replaced by the sharp, terrifying adrenaline of reality. He looked up at the massive screens displaying the defaulted debts and the stolen patents. He looked at Charles, who was currently hyperventilating against the table. Then slowly Cameron turned to look at Peyton. Peyton was a chaotic mess of ruined designer silk and smeared makeup. She reached out her trembling hands, grasping frantically at Cameron's tuxedo jacket. "Cameron, please," she sobbed. Her voice a hysterical, high-pitched whine. "Please, you have to help us. You have to do something. Tell them this is a mistake." Cameron stared down at her hands, clutching his jacket. The realization washed over his pale face. The $50 million Vanguard buyout was gone. The immense wealth he had been promised for enduring this miserable union was a complete fiction. He was married to a woman who was entirely broke, hopelessly disgraced, and actively facing severe federal charges. The suffocating trap he had been forced into had just disintegrated. Cameron reached down and firmly detached Peyton's fingers from his jacket. He did not say a single word to her. He simply reached up to his lapel, unpinned the delicate white rose boutonniere, and dropped it onto the marble floor. He turned his back on his weeping bride, stepped over the shattered champagne glass, and walked away from the head table. He moved through the parting crowd with steady, deliberate steps, leaving Peyton completely alone. Peyton let out a shattered, agonizing scream. She collapsed onto the table, burying her face in her arms, as her pristine, carefully curated life was entirely obliterated. Charles pushed himself away from the table, his eyes wild with desperate panic. He looked at Harrison, raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "Mr. Vance, please," Charles begged, his voice trembling with raw fear. "We can negotiate this. We can come to an arrangement. I can offer you a substantial discount on the assets. We can keep this quiet." Harrison did not even blink. "Vanguard Holdings does not negotiate with criminals," he stated, his voice ringing with absolute chilling authority. At that exact moment, the harsh alternating flash of blue and white lights began to reflect off the high stone walls of the villa. The sharp, piercing wail of police sirens echoed up the long gravel driveway, cutting through the cool evening air. The sound multiplied, indicating a massive, coordinated arrival. Charles froze, the last remaining drops of blood draining from his face. "You called the authorities," Charles whispered, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. "You actually called the Italian police." "I did not have to," I replied, stepping down from the stage and walking slowly toward him. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation coordinated the entire operation with international authorities weeks ago. They were simply waiting for you to cross the border with what you believed were the uncut diamonds." Heavy footsteps echoed against the stone steps leading up to the terrace. A dozen uniformed Italian police officers, flanked by 2 plainclothes Interpol agents, marched onto the patio. They moved with swift, aggressive purpose, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. The wedding guests scrambled out of their way, pressing themselves against the stone balustrades. Charles held up his hands, attempting to summon his fading arrogance. "There is a misunderstanding here," Charles announced to the approaching officers, forcing a strained, unnatural smile. "I am a prominent American businessman. I demand to speak with the embassy. I have the resources to clear this up immediately." Harrison stepped forward seamlessly, intercepting the lead Interpol agent. He reached into his tailored jacket and produced a thick, sealed folder. "There is no misunderstanding," Harrison said, handing the folder directly to the agent. "Vanguard security personnel intercepted and secured the airport security footage from your departure in Chicago. The drive contains high-definition video of Charles Vivian and Peyton Vance actively accessing Hazel luggage and planting the velvet pouch containing the stones." Harrison gestured toward the monitors behind the head table. "Furthermore," he continued, his tone perfectly professional, "you will find a comprehensive forensic audit prepared by my lead investigator. It details the exact routing numbers, the offshore shell companies, and the definitive proof of corporate embezzlement used to fund the purchase of those assets. They fully intended to smuggle stolen wealth across your borders. The lead agent reviewed the documents, briefly nodding to Harrison before turning his cold gaze upon my father. Charles Vance, the agent, said, his heavily accented English carrying absolute finality. "You are under arrest for international smuggling, conspiracy, and corporate fraud." Two uniformed officers stepped forward. They grabbed Charles by the arms, spinning him around and forcing his hands behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing across the silent terrace sounded like a gunshot. Charles did not fight them. His legs seemed to give out, his shoulders slumping, as the reality of his impending imprisonment finally crushed his arrogant spirit. As the officers began to march Charles away, the polished, controlled facade of my mother entirely shattered. Vivian let out a guttural, horrifying wail. She scrambled out from behind the head table, her designer heels catching on the stone floor. She stumbled forward and lunged directly toward me. She dropped to her knees on the hard marble, her hands grasping desperately at the fabric of my dress. Her perfectly styled hair was falling around her face, her expensive makeup running in dark, ruined streaks down her cheeks. She was sobbing, genuine, terrified tears pouring from her eyes. She was looking at a future devoid of wealth, devoid of status, and entirely devoid of the power she had wielded so cruelly for decades. "Hazel, please!" Vivian screamed, her voice cracking with hysterical panic. "Please, you have to stop this. Tell them it is a mistake. We are your family. You are our daughter. You cannot do this to us." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the broken, weeping woman clutching the hem of my dress. I waited for the heavy burden of daughterly guilt to pull at my chest. I waited for the familiar, suffocating pressure of obligation to force me to comfort her, to make myself small so she could feel powerful. I waited for the deeply ingrained fear of her disapproval to dictate my actions. But as I stared into her panicked, desperate eyes, absolutely nothing happened. The emotional chains that had bound me to this toxic family for my entire life simply dissolved into dust. I felt a profound, incredible lightness settling deep within my bones. I looked down at my mother, and the memories flashed through my mind with vivid, undeniable clarity. I remembered the endless years of constant verbal abuse, the way she had systematically dismantled my confidence to build up Peyton. I remembered the countless times she had gladly offered me up as the scapegoat to protect their fraudulent, glittering image. But most clearly, I remembered the cold fluorescent lights of the airport terminal when I was 15 years old. I remembered the casual, indifferent shrug she had given me as she handed me two crumpled $100 bills. I remembered the way she had turned her back on me, walking away to enjoy a luxurious vacation with her new husband, while I stood completely alone and terrified. I reached down and calmly, deliberately pried her trembling fingers off the fabric of my dress. I took a slow step backward, removing myself entirely from her desperate reach. "I am socially unfit for this family, Mom," I said, my voice incredibly calm and completely devoid of any warmth, echoing the exact insult Peyton had used to exclude me from the bridal party. Vivian let out a strangled gasp, shaking her head wildly. No, we did not mean it, Hazel. We love you. Please. You told me to figure it out at the airport." I continued my words, cutting cleanly through her hysterical sobbing. "You left me with nothing and told me to survive on my own." I looked at the police officers escorting my father toward the waiting vehicles and then back down at my mother. "Now you figure it out." I turned my back on her for the absolute last time. I did not look at Peyton, who was still weeping uncontrollably at the ruined head table. I did not look at Charles as he was forced into the back of an Italian police cruiser. I simply began walking toward the terrace exit. Harrison fell into step beside me, his tall, imposing presence a comforting, steady anchor in the fading chaos. The elite Vanguard security team seamlessly formed a protective perimeter around us, holding back the few aggressive reporters and curious guests who tried to push their way closer. We walked down the wide stone steps of the villa, leaving the screaming, ruined remnants of my family behind us, to face the devastating reality of international smuggling and federal corporate fraud charges. The cool evening air washed over my face, carrying the sweet scent of jasmine, and the undeniable intoxicating taste of absolute freedom. The ride to the private airfield was quiet and incredibly peaceful. The heavy tension that had gripped my shoulders for months was completely gone. We bypassed the crowded commercial terminals and drove directly onto the tarmac, pulling up beside the massive, gleaming Vanguard Holdings private jet. The flight crew greeted us with respectful nods, ushering us up the stairs and into the remarkably luxurious cabin. The interior of the aircraft was a masterpiece of modern corporate design. Deep leather seats, polished mahogany tables, and soft ambient lighting created an atmosphere of supreme comfort and security. The heavy cabin door sealed shut behind us, locking out the noise and the chaos of the world below. I sank into one of the oversized leather seats, letting out a long, shuddering breath. The adrenaline that had fueled my actions on the terrace was finally beginning to ebb, leaving behind a deep, satisfying exhaustion. I watched out the window as the jet engines roared to life, the aircraft taxiing smoothly down the runway before lifting effortlessly into the dark, star-filled sky. We were going home. Harrison took the seat directly across from me. The imposing, terrifying CEO persona he had projected on the terrace had vanished. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and loosened his tie, a genuine, relaxed smile spreading across his handsome face. He looked at me with an expression of profound, unfiltered mutual respect. He reached over to the small polished bar built into the console between our seats. He retrieved a chilled bottle of vintage champagne and 2 crystal flutes. He popped the cork with a soft, satisfying hiss and poured the sparkling golden liquid into the glasses. He handed one to me, his fingers brushing lightly against mine. "I have executed dozens of hostile corporate takeovers in my career," Harrison noted, his deep voice filled with warm amusement. "I have seen brilliant legal maneuvers and ruthless financial strategies. But the way you systematically dismantled that empire, the way you trapped them in their own arrogance and bought their defaulted debts right out from under them, it was an absolute masterpiece of strategic execution." He raised his glass toward me, his eyes shining with admiration. "You missed your calling as a CEO, Hazel. You have the mind for it." I held the crystal flute, feeling the cool glass against my palm. I thought about the logistics empire I now legally owned. I thought about the massive fortune I had secured through my own brilliant software patents. I thought about the incredible unwritten future stretching out before me, completely free of the toxic chains of my past. I took a slow sip of the champagne, the bubbles dancing lightly on my tongue. I looked out the window at the endless expanse of the night sky, watching the lights of Italy fade into the darkness far below. I smiled, turning back to look at Harrison, feeling more powerful and more alive than I ever had in my entire life. "I did not miss it," I said softly, my voice filled with unwavering confidence. "I am just getting started." 6 months can pass in the blink of an eye when you are finally living a life of your own design. The afternoon sun streamed through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my beautifully appointed new corner office, casting long golden shadows across the polished hardwood floor. Outside, the sprawling Chicago skyline stretched out in a magnificent display of steel and glass, completely unbothered by the bitter, chilly autumn winds sweeping off the lake. I turned my leather chair away from the spectacular view and looked toward the frosted glass door at the far end of the room. The sleek silver lettering etched across the center panel read, "Hazel and Associates Elite Corporate Restructuring." It was a brilliant, tangible, undeniable testament to the new empire I had built entirely on my own terms. On the far wall, a very large flat-screen television played a muted local news broadcast. I picked up a silver remote from my desk and turned up the volume just enough to catch the anchor's somber practice tone. The screen flashed a familiar courthouse graphic before cutting to live footage captured outside the federal building downtown. There, tightly flanked by a swarm of aggressive, shouting reporters and federal marshals, were my ruined parents. Charles and Vivian looked completely unrecognizable. The expensive tailored suits and designer silk gowns were gone, replaced by the harsh, humiliating reality of federal custody. Charles looked deeply, incredibly aged, his weary shoulders stooped and his face gaunt, as he was led toward a transport vehicle. Vivian walked closely behind him, her heavy head bowed to hide her pale, tear-stained face from the flashing cameras. The news anchor smoothly reported that Charles and Vivian Vance had just been officially sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for a massive coordinated string of wire fraud, embezzlement, and international smuggling conspiracy. There were no high-priced defense attorneys capable of saving them, no secret offshore accounts left to bail them out. I had meticulously seized every last asset they owned to settle their defaulted corporate debts. The broadcast transitioned to a brief segment detailing the total collateral damage of their fully collapsed logistics empire. The camera cut to a shaky, grainy cell phone video taken inside a brightly lit discount retail store. Peyton was standing directly behind a cash register, wearing a stiff, incredibly unflattering polyester uniform polo shirt. Her perfectly manicured socialite persona was permanently obliterated. She looked utterly miserable, ringing up cheap merchandise for impatient customers with a dull, defeated expression. The trust fund she had relied on was gone. The glamorous European wedding had evaporated the moment Cameron realized she was penniless. She was finally living the very life she used to mercilessly mock every day, stripped of her stolen wealth and forced to survive entirely on minimum wage. I muted the television again and turned my attention back to the massive mahogany desk in front of me. Spread across the dark wood was a newly drafted, incredibly lucrative restructuring contract for a multinational tech conglomerate. They were hiring my firm to audit their European supply chain, requesting the exact forensic expertise that had brought down my father. I picked up a heavy gold pen, reviewing the final clauses with a profound, unshakable confidence. I felt an overwhelming sense of peace settling deep within my chest. I was completely financially free, unburdened by the toxic, suffocating expectations of a family that had only ever viewed me as an expendable asset. I had stopped running, stopped hiding, and stepped fully into my own power. A soft knock broke the quiet hum of the office. The frosted glass door opened, and Harrison walked into the room. He was dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, projecting that same effortless, commanding presence he possessed the night we dismantled my father in Italy. But he did not walk into my office as a savior or a superior. He walked in as a trusted business partner and an absolute equal. "We have a reservation at that new steakhouse on the river in 30 minutes, Harrison said, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Are you ready to get out of here?" I looked down at the contract, signed my name with a swift, definitive flourish, and gently closed my laptop. I stood up, grabbing my tailored wool coat from the back of my chair, and flashed him a genuine, radiant smile. "I am absolutely ready," I replied smoothly. "And tonight, I am definitively the one who is buying." The story of Hazel Vance is a potent reminder that your worth is never defined by those who refuse to see it. For years, she played the role of the defective daughter, the one meant to be sacrificed for the sake of her family's fragile image. But the most important shift didn't happen on that stage. It happened during the quiet, grueling years she spent building her own empire while they weren't looking. The lesson here is simple, yet difficult. Stop begging for a seat at a table where you aren't valued. When you are constantly being undermined by those closest to you, the natural instinct is to fight for their recognition. That is a trap. The energy you spend trying to prove yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you is energy stolen from your own growth. Instead, take that energy and channel it into building your own foundation. Success, when achieved on your own terms, isn't just a win, it's a boundary. Hazel didn't just get even, she got ahead. She realized that the best way to handle toxic expectations is to render them irrelevant through your own undeniable excellence. By the time the world saw what she had built, her former tormentors no longer had the power to hurt her because she no longer needed their validation to breathe. You have your own secret weapon, your resilience, your unique talent, and your unwavering ability to start over. Cultivate that. Protect it. Build in silence until your success speaks so loudly that it demands respect, even from those who once looked the other way. You don't need their permission to be magnificent. Have you ever been the black sheep of your family, only to rise above the doubt and claim your own victory? I want to hear your story. Share your experience in the comments below. And if you're ready to stop seeking approval and start rewriting your own narrative, hit that subscribe button. Let's reclaim our worth together.